We now have the first item on the agenda, preparation of the European Council meeting of 17th and 18th December. I first of all give the floor to the President in Office, Nicolas Schmit.
Monsieur le Président, Mesdames.
President, members. The European Council's agenda in December will be a full one. There will be vital issues for Europe on the agenda, such as migration, combating terrorism, economic and monetary union, the internal market, energy union, climate policy, and the issue of the UK referendum. This European Council will be tackling current crises and also giving general political guidance for the future. Council has been working intensively on all of these issues, and a lot has been achieved over the last few months. I'd like to start by outlining some of these points, if I may. First of all, migration. The first priority for all of us is to implement what has been decided. All the institutions are doing their utmost to implement the conclusions of the European Council. The scale of this crisis makes it ever clearer to us day by day that that is not enough. We have an immediate effect, but we need rules, and the rules need to be respected. That is also vital, equally vital. We need to look at the situation in the field and deal with current shortcomings. I'm thinking particularly of the hotspots, resettlement and returns. We need to strengthen the protection of our external borders in the Schengen area so that irregular migrants will be stopped. We need to strengthen Frontex, and countries such as Greece calling for this strengthening will need to be able to count on effective assistance. Keeping Schengen is our absolute objective, but if we were to achieve that, we need to improve management of external borders, and the Commission has made significant proposals in relation to that matter. Continuing cooperation with countries of origin and transit is also vital in operational terms. It's also vital in terms of dealing with the root causes of migratory phenomena. In that context, the European Council also intends to adopt conclusions on Syria, giving decisive support to all efforts to achieve a political process and also expressing the will to combat all terrorist forces. Combating terrorism. Following the Paris attacks, various measures have been adopted and they need to be rapidly implemented now. One of the most crucial issues is that of cooperation and exchange of information. We're not talking about setting up something like a European CIA or something along those lines, but what we do need to do is ensure that cooperation between the relevant services is stepped up. The agreement on PNR will also play a vital role in combating terrorism, and I would like to thank Mr. Keko and all those who have worked on achieving an agreement on this very difficult matter. Cooperation with third countries is also an absolute necessity. Economic and monetary union. The report of the 5 presidents on completion of EMU was presented in June last, and work has continued in various council formations since then. The Commission presented follow-up proposals on the 21st of October last, and yesterday you held discussions in plenary. We all agree that a reform of the euro area is still a necessity. The European Council has been called upon to direct future work, while certain matters we have to recognize are still controversial matters. The presidency of the European Council would like to see an in-depth discussion taking place so that institutions can take that as a basis for moving forward. Another item on the Council agenda is in relation to the internal market. The internal market, of course, is at the heart of European integration. The Commission recently submitted several communications and reports that will constitute the basis for the work of the European Council. The aim is to strengthen and deepen the internal market in various areas where there are still shortcomings. Goods and services with a new strategy, and above all, the digital single market and the European capitals market. We need to give the single market a more dynamic nature with a view to boosting competitiveness and jobs. Energy union and climate policy. We were all delighted at the success of COP21. I know that you also held a discussion on that yesterday. The European Council will, of course, be giving Council and the Commission a mandate to assess the results of that. We need to look at the framework for climate and energy actions with an eye on 2030, so we're looking at implementation there, showing the way and setting the example. The European Council will also come back to the issue of energy union with a view to an in-depth discussion in March next. Finally, the UK referendum. Following in-depth consultation, the President of the European Council has outlined his intentions in a letter of the 7th of December last. The European Council in December will not be called upon to take a decision on the UK's demands, but there will be a political discussion of all of the matters raised. The form and nature of any eventual agreement will be discussed at a later stage. President Tusk, in his letter to members of the European Council, informed heads of state and government that he had requested that the presidency should put the issue of policy on Russian sanctions on the COREPER agenda. To conclude, I would like to reiterate my gratitude to the European Parliament for its responsibility and commitment. It has shown responsibility and commitment in relation to various different issues and challenges that we're currently faced with, including migration. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Schmit. I now give the floor to Mr. Juncker on behalf of the Commission.
President, ladies and gentlemen.
The main issues of discussions for tomorrow's European Council will be the management of the refugee crisis, the implementation of our security agenda, and the deepening of the economic and monetary union. I said in the State of the Union speech on the 9th of September, and I want to repeat it, this is no time for business as usual, no time for half measures, no time for hesitation. I announced plans for a European border and coast guard, and here we are. The Commission has now agreed those plans, and I call on the Parliament and the Council to treat them as a matter of urgency. We have no time to lose when it comes to preserving the Schengen area of free movement. For this, effective management of our external borders must be a priority. The Commission is not the government of the European Union. It seems new for you, but Mr. Farage would like the Commission to be the government of Europe, but it is not. When the situation requires so, when there are threats to our way of living together, we have to take our responsibility and prepare a collective response. We have done this for the banking system by transferring preventive and remedial mechanisms to the European level, because the crisis has shown that national authorities were alone to deal with transnational problems. The proposal we have put forward yesterday, under the leadership of my good friend Frans Timmermans and Commissioner Avramopoulos, the proposal for a European border and coast guard follows the same logic. It will bring the missing link to strengthen our external borders so that people can continue to live and move freely within our Union. We Europeans no longer have many borders. We have one, and we have a shared responsibility to protect it. The European Border and Coast Guard is not the answer to a new need. The European Border and Coast Guard is there to repair a weakness of our Schengen system. We are completing what should have been done from the start. Member States will continue to keep their competence and sovereignty on their borders. They will continue to manage the external border day to day. The European Border and Coast Guard will assess migratory flows across the whole of the Union, identify our weak spots, require Member States to take action when needed. Member States will be able to request joint operations and rapid border intervention. But where urgent problems persist and no action is taken, the Commission will assume its responsibility for the system as a whole and take, together with the Member States, appropriate decisions for the European Border and Coast Guard to intervene. If there is a serious problem at our external border, we cannot stand aside and do nothing. We have to act. The Commission proposes to establish a permanent staff of 1,000 and a reserve pool of at least 1,500 experts who can be deployed within 72 hours. A new European Return Office with the new agency will accelerate the return of irregular migrants by deploying teams of specialists across the Union. A new standard travel document for return will ensure wider acceptance of returnees by third countries. All of you know my views on Schengen, but to avoid any doubt, let me be absolutely clear. Under my leadership, we will do everything possible to protect what we have built and to make it better and to make it stronger. We want to defend everything that Schengen represents, and as we prepare for a new year, our determination is stronger than ever. So let me tell you, Schengen is here to stay. This is why the Commission proposes to strengthen the Schengen Border Code so that every person entering the Schengen area, whether they are an EU national or a third country national, will undergo a security check against national and European databases. And checks on all individuals will now be mandatory when exiting the European Union as well. These are the costs of a riskier world, and we cannot avoid them. Tomorrow I will call on the European Council to respond positively and urgently to all these proposals. Here I want to thank Mr. President this House for its support over the course of this year. The Parliament worked closely with the Commission when it mattered most. You responded quickly and diligently to all our proposals, and I count on your support as we continue our work together. The refugee crisis does not begin at Europe's borders. Last month, we opened a new chapter in our relations with Turkey, a country that already hosts 2.2 million refugees, more than any other country in the world. The situation demands that we work together. Yesterday, the Commission adopted the recommendation for a voluntary humanitarian admission scheme for refugees from Syria who are currently in Turkey. If our neighbour is facing a humanitarian emergency, then we have a duty to help. All 28 member states have worked on this proposal, but it remains voluntary. Those member states that want to help can do so, and I hope that all the 28 are ready to help. Mr. President, when I came to you in September, Europe was not in a good shape. Our governments were very busy blaming each other or pointing the finger at Brussels. The situation required urgent action. On the 29th of September, the Commission adopted a communication outlining the immediate operational, budgetary and legal measures under the European agenda on migration. We concluded that the implementation of European Union law with regard to building a common European asylum system had been proceeding too slowly in the Member States. As a result, on the 15th of October, we presented the communication setting out the next steps for the coming next 6 months. In particular, the Commission called on Greece and Italy to roll out the remaining hotspots, to authorise those existing, to improve the registration capacity within the Eurodac fingerprinting system, and to organise the swift transfers of migrants from hotspot areas to second-line reception facilities. The situation in Greece and in Italy has improved, but there are still remaining things to be done. This is why I convened the leaders of the Western Balkans to bring everyone round the table and to start a conversation. As a result, our officials now talk on a daily basis and coordinate actions across the whole of the region. I know that it will take some time before we fully control every aspect of the situation, but we are moving in the right direction. The European Union's humanitarian assistance to the Western Balkans now stands at €22 million, helping to give comfort and restore dignity to thousands of refugees along that route. But make no mistake, progress is still too slow, and our member states need to do more, and they need to do it quickly. While they accelerate relocations and returns, they must also agree the crisis relocation mechanism so that in the future Europe can react more quickly. They need to agree the safe countries of origin so that we can increase the efficiency of the asylum system and speed up the return of irregular migrants. They need to match the funding that the European Union has mobilised for the Syria Trust Fund. And they need to deliver everything agreed at the Valletta Summit, where we launched a new partnership with our African neighbours. We need to honour all our commitments, and we need to do it now. This is the message I will take once again to the European Council tomorrow and the day after tomorrow. Monsieur le Président, Mesdames, Messieurs,
President, ladies and gentlemen, Europeans want to be able to go on living in security in a space where free movement contributes to their lifestyle, their studies and their work. But the images which have characterised 2015 rest imprinted in their memories. And the recent events in Paris have shown that the worst is always possible. Around Europe, 24 hours a day, men and women, whether they're police, magistrates, judges, are fully devoted to ensuring the safety of our citizens. It's our obligation to facilitate their work by giving them the tools they need so that they can better coordinate their activities in what for them is a day-to-day fight. Of course, safeguarding security is a national prerogative, but it is clear that better coordination at an EU level is required, and that also applies to cooperation between secret services. Terrorism recognises no border, and therefore our response must be global. Whatever some say, who put things together in dangerous ways. Terrorists travelling to Europe prefer the safety of aircraft than ramshackle vessels. So I'm happy that we've finally reached an agreement on the European passenger name register, and I'd like to thank all members of the European Parliament who worked towards that end. According to Europol, something like 5,000 Europeans have gone to fight in countries like Syria or Iraq. Some of them have already returned. Amongst them, some have attacked the societies in which they were born and in which they grew up with unprecedented violence. In the face of that, we must adapt and step up the EU's legal arsenal on prevention and the fighting of terrorist acts. And above all, when it comes to the financing of terrorist activities, that is the whole rhyme and reason of the Commission's newly presented directive on combating terrorism, which I hope will swiftly be adopted. Come what may, we must never forget that freedom and security are not contradictions in terms. Preserving and defending that compatibility between freedom and security is something that is a hallmark of the way we live together. It's a matter of identity and a matter of values. President, the European Council will be the occasion to discuss economic and monetary union and the single market. And so it's right to recall that freedom also goes hand in hand with prosperity. Innovation, growth, employment, competitiveness do not like borders. When we have problems in one of our countries, we must try and offer a comprehensive answer to the problems of that country. When we have the same problem in several countries, we are duty-bound to act. I say that in particular with reference to the serious situation facing the European steel-making industry. We can't just recoil within our shell and hope to meet thereby the expectations of Europeans who want to establish businesses, fund their businesses, or find open markets and good communication and transport systems, reliable energy supplies, and reasonably priced energy. That is why, when we tabled our work programme, we stressed the need to complete our single market where it is still incomplete and fill in the gaps. That's a digital single market, capital markets union, and an energy union. I'm delighted at the agreement recently reached in Paris on climate change, which will enable us to make progress towards the objectives set down in the energy union, whilst stepping up our financial contribution on climate policies for developing countries. In German. President, let me just conclude on the European Union and its foreseeable future. Nothing is ever simple in Europe, and it will never be simple in Europe. Things and people, people and things need to be brought together. But whenever there were problems, men and women have stood up because they didn't want to endure history, but because they wanted to shape history. That's the way it always was, and that's the way it always will be. The impossible seems impossible until it has been done. Thank you.
Thank you very much, President of the Commission. And now, on behalf of the EPP, I give the floor to Mr. Weber. Presidents, colleagues, 2015 saw at the European level that we had to deliver. And I would like to ask the Commission and thank them for what they have put forward to the ideas about the future of Europe. And in European Parliament we have tried to give backup for this in legislative terms. The proposal from yesterday and the considerations on improving the protection of our foreign borders in order to serve Europe is in the logic of Europe. On behalf of my group, I would like to express my support. And I hear that we see discussions on nationality and sovereignty everywhere in Europe. Many groups estimate this as a great value, and of course for the individual states. But, for example, what we see in Greece, in Hungary and Spain, we see that it's not a question of safeguarding the local borders, but European borders. And therefore, when we ask the citizens today, they will tell us, I'm not interested in the rules of the national states, whether they decide or whether it's Europe that decides, but we want to see the right conditions at the European borders. And that's why we must support the Commission. And on behalf of my group, I would like to say that we will not be voting in favor of the Frontex legislation as long as the command question has not been decided. Because if a member state does not implement at the border, then somebody else must be able to safeguard that border. That's Frontex. And colleagues, I'd like to thank Mr. Schmit on behalf of the Council, because he said that tomorrow they will not be talking about new ideas, but they're trying to draw a balance of what has been happening, and that's necessary. Please don't put forward any new ideas, but implement everything that has been agreed so far. The Italian and British governments are, for example, have some very good ideas about the Lisbon issues and so on, and all the drafting is there. But we can talk as much as we like, but what's important that we insist that the Britain and Italy live up to their commitments on the African Fund. And of course, we talk about the 40,000 refugees in Italy. We need to do something about that, and we need to make sure that our ideas are implemented. And I have one basic comment to say about 2015. Very often we talk about professionals and their views, but we're not really taking into account citizens and their ideas about the future development of Europe. And maybe we shouldn't talk about the crisis in Europe, not about the concerns that Europe might fail altogether tomorrow, but we should look at the facts, what we have achieved in 2015. In 2015, Charlie, we had Charlie Hebdo, and in recent weeks we've seen the necessary legislation being put forward with respect to combating terrorism, for example, a Europol mandate. And we have seen thousands of people drowning in the Mediterranean. They were refugees, and in the Mediterranean we have seen Marines from all over Europe actually being active in the Mediterranean to save people. And we need to have a robust mandate for Mrs. Federini. And it's thanks to Mr. Juncker that Greece has been retained within Europe so that we give people a stable prospect for their future. We need to see the interest rates being changed and set up and the pension system set up in Greece and so on. But we've also had the issue of Ukraine, and it's been a huge success that the EU has seen the extension of the embargo, because that's a response to the European nationalism, Russian nationalism. We've seen the climate summit in Paris, and without all these courageous actions, we wouldn't have seen that we couldn't really do anything about climate change. But we couldn't do anything unless we had Paris, so we have shown an example to the rest of the world when we're talking about climate change. And then data protection. We have the rules now on data protection. Look about Google and Facebook. They're simply trying to sort of bend the rules in order to impose their own standards. But let's fight for the citizens. We have 2% growth in the European area. Growth is coming back. We're achieving something in Europe. And I would like to see, when we talk about Europe, we're not just talking about sort of one crisis summit and then another crisis summit. So we want to give the citizens an idea that we can do something, we can achieve something, and we have achieved a great deal in 2015 in Europe. And that should also be the message to the Brits. Member states are important, national sovereignty is important, member states should be strong, but we should stand together because that's the way we are stronger. Thank you very much.
Herr Weber, es gibt
Mr. Weber, whenever you speak, you see that the number of blue cards come forward. Mrs. Rapini.
Thank you, President. Mr. Weber, you're very authoritative in what you say, in saying what your points of view. You are representing the biggest group in Parliament. Do you think that citizens of Bulgaria and Romania who aren't part of Schengen should have a different regime? Shouldn't they be treated in the same way? Do you support the citizens of Romania and Bulgaria or not?
When we are talking about the Schengen area, our main task is to deal with the problems within the area. And our main effort should be to retain and preserve the Schengen area. We would like Bulgaria and Romania to be members, and the progress that's been made in these two countries means that there is good chances for these two countries to join the Schengen area.
Das Wort hat jetzt für die Sozialdemokratie.
On behalf of the Socialist, Mr. Pittella.
I switched you off there. I'm sorry, I thought you...
That's okay. Yeah.
Thank you. President, I would like to start by thanking Minister Nicolas Schmit on behalf of the Luxembourg presidency for the excellent work which has been done over a particularly difficult presidency period. Last Sunday, French voters reined in the far right. But we still need to be careful, because it's a warning to us all that selfishness, nationalism, these factors held us back from the kind of European action that we've been hearing about this morning. And I think the events in France, the French elections, should open the eyes of those who've been keeping their eyes closed so far. We've had a proposal for a European external border protection strengthening, and I think that's quite appropriate. But we need the other pillars too. We need a binding resettlement system and a revision of the Dublin system. We know that things are not working well with the refugee crisis, and member states have entered into commitments. We need to ensure that those commitments are met. We have the rule of law. We are a community of law. So if we have people entering into commitments and then not respecting them, that can lead to disintegration of the unit. So we need to look at resettlement on the basis of the existing agreements. We need new mechanisms in order to ensure that a greater number of asylum seekers can be resettled. Everyone has said that the Dublin system is creaking at the edges, but we need something new to help us to deal with the realities of the situation. So we need to act soon, but we also need to act in relation to the economic crisis. I see it as a provocation to say that the principle of flexibility should now be drawn into question within the Stability Pact. We don't need less flexibility, but more flexibility. The Juncker plan is a jewel. Let's not leave it in the jeweller's shop. Let's go out and explain and disseminate, talk to local, regional, national authorities, businesses. It's time for the social AAA to be put into practice. The mobility package from the Commission can open the way to other initiatives dealing with the priorities of social policy. But we cannot have any resignation to the decline of European industry. We need to act there too. The steel sector is threatened by commercial dumping. If we do not act soon, the European steel industry will disappear, taking thousands of jobs with it. There's a call for help from businesses and workers. President Juncker, I turn to you because I know how sensitive you are to this issue. And I say to you that we as Socialists and Democrats see the granting of market economy status to China is premature. On Brexit, I repeat what I said when we were faced with Grexit. As Socialists and Democrats, we will do all we can to keep the UK in the EU. We want to help our British friends to stay in the EU, and we also feel that Mr. Cameron needs to have a clear and positive commitment to the conclusion of the negotiations. I agree with Mr. Weber that we should not have any fatalism or resignation. There are problems. It's far from being a bed of roses, but we need to deal with those problems, tackling them head on and giving a true value to the year 2016 as we start to act. We need to act together, Parliament and Commission, as we've done over the last few months. Do more of that. And we need real leaders, true leaders, with us as well. Those national leaders who want the EU to do well and prosper, and then we can save the European model.
Thank you,
Mr. Pittella. For the ECR group, the chairman, Mr. Kamall.
Thank you very much. No, for every single one of this week's summit items, there is no simple answer, no simple soundbite, no one policy, no one council conclusion to solve all the crises facing Europe. And far too many people offer simplistic responses. Some speak of more Europe, a single EU intelligence agency, a single European army, leading to a single European government. Others speak of no Europe, closing our borders completely, no entry, no migration, no cooperation. And sometimes the only voices that appear to be heard are those of the extremes. And our politics is in danger of becoming more polarised at a time when our world becomes more complex. But these crises, they descend 140 characters of a tweet. Don't tweet that, by the way. The migration and the refugee crisis has no simple answers. There is no silver bullet. It must be tackled at source, and we must work our way to a political solution in Syria, however slowly and however frustrating that is. But not everyone who is coming here is necessarily fleeing war, but understandably seeking a better life. But who can blame them? But we simply cannot offer everyone a home regardless of their personal circumstances. We must have clear rules in place to grant asylum to those genuinely fleeing persecution, but to return economic migrants to apply through existing immigration channels. But instead, we see one large member state sending out a message that everyone is welcome, regardless of their personal circumstances, regardless of their reason for travelling, and then berates other member states when they re-erect borders. We see other member states not living up to their responsibilities to detain and process people. And when they're unable to cope, they don't ask for help. So instead of all this, we see knee-jerk policies in the heat of a crisis, like a relocation scheme based on a simple idea, but never really rooted in reality, only helping 116 people to date, 160 people to date. And when reality bites, the rhetoric changes. So when Schengen states talk of re-erecting borders, we finally focus on strengthening the EU's external borders, with talk about a European border guard. Yes, we agree. Enhancing Frontex and cooperating to help Frontex can help. But we need to be very careful about how and what we agree now will work, not just for the next few months, but for the years ahead. And instead of compulsion over member states, we need more cooperation between member states, not using a crisis to undermine sovereignty. The same goes for the terrorism crisis we now face. We must react calmly and rationally with policies to address the threat. And yes, it's good to see member states, some of our member states, are going after Daesh in the Middle East. But we now need to build trust between member states' intelligence agencies to share data, not compel them. And we must also tackle the wider issues that lead young people to be recruited by Daesh. The identity crisis that leaves young people vulnerable to Daesh's tactics will only be made worse if we seek to demonise or ostracise our Muslim communities in our countries. Now, turning to the UK's request for reform, you may be surprised to hear that I might have a few words to say about this. But we all know that the majority of these requests could be accommodated relatively easily. And there's some work to do to accommodate both the UK's requests and to pursue further European reform. As a British Conservative, I'm proud that it's a British Prime Minister who will deliver a referendum for the British people. Dream on. As a British MEP, I will help where I can with the renegotiation process and to explain to colleagues here and to my voters who will have the final say. But as the leader of the ECR group, I hope this process will act as a catalyst for EU-wide reforms. So looking at the summit agenda, there are some tough issues that need some proper thinking and planning. 2014 was a year of a new European Parliament, a new Commission and a Council President. But 2015 has been a year of knee-jerk reactions. 2016 needs to be the year for laying the groundwork for long-term solutions based on cooperation.
And Brexit.
Thank you, Mr. Kamall. Mr. Coburn, we missed you. Mr. Coburn shouting out rubbish and so on. Mr. Etheridge very surprisingly asked a question of you, Mr. Kamall. I see he's very surprised that I've called him.
Good morning and Merry Christmas, Mr. Kamall. It's nice to be close to you. I'm normally up in the gods up there. I heard a lot of what you don't want, so I'm going to try and pin you down on something you do want. Now, I'm not going to ask you about the referendum because you've sidestepped that at least a dozen times. So what I wonder is, do you still hold with your party and your leaders' long-term aim to give full EU membership to Turkey? And if that's the case, when would you like to see that happen?
Actually, I think that we all need to be completely honest with Turkey. I have said this a number of times. Let's be honest, Turkey will never join the EU. I'm sorry. But there are too many reasons why Turkey will not join. Some of it based on pure prejudice about their faith and about Turks. Some because people believe that Turkey is not in Europe. Some because they want a common foreign security policy and they do not want the borders to be with Iran, Syria and Iraq. Also, others because they worry about given the population of Turkey, the number of MEPs they will have and the votes in council. You put all those reasons together, actually we've got to stop being dishonest with Turkey. It's time for all of us to be honest and say that they will never be members of the EU.
Thank you. For the Liberals group, the chairman, Mr. Verhofstadt.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. President. Yesterday I posted two short films on my Facebook as an introduction of the debate of today. One short film on how Syrian refugees are treated the last months on the Hungarian border, and then a second short film how Mr. Trudeau, the Canadian Prime Minister, has welcomed them a couple of days ago, these 25,000 who entered in Canada. And I have to tell you, if you look to the pictures and you put them next to each other, the difference cannot be bigger. It's even shocking. And it's not the case that you can enter without any problem in Canada. There is border control in Canada, that's very clear, but the pictures show that they are received there in a decent way, in a human way, with compassion, and not with fear. not with hate, by entering, I should say, through a normal door and not on their knees under barbed wire, coming into Europe. So there's also the main reason, Mr. Juncker, why I fully applaud, and my group fully applaud, the proposal of the European Commission to set up a European border and coast guard, to stop what is in fact happening today, to stop what is in fact an insane competition between some member states who, like in a ping-pong game, are moving the refugees from one neighbouring border to another. To stop also, I think, the chaotic, not to say sometimes non-existing management of some of our borders, like, for example, is the case in Greece. So I believe that your proposal is key. This European border and coast guard, because without it, it could be the end of Schengen, and it could be also the end of the European project. And I think even that countries that don't want to participate to the European border and coast guard have no place in the Schengen area if they are not willing to cooperate in this. And so my plea to the European Council now is, because the European Commission has done its work, is to decide on it. You don't do it. I have here, that's the advantage with the Council, they have already their conclusion before they are meeting each other. That's the difference with the European Parliament. We meet and then we conclude. There they have it before. Well, it's not in the conclusions. In paragraph 2 they say we're going to examine it. Why is it not possible, Mr. Schmit? Why is it not possible to decide really, yes, the European Council is in favour of a European border and coast guard, and then to start naturally to examine together with the two institutions, based on a fast-track procedure, the proposals of the Commission? No, it's not possible. It is examined. Well, I hope that you come back to debrief about the European Council together with Mr. Tusk, and that's going to be changed in your conclusions, that at least the principle of the Commission is done and is agreed to. And that brings me to my second point, the fight against terrorism. Also here, let me say, it's not your fault. I think it is the services of Mr. Tusk who have prepared it. The conclusions are completely weak. The only thing about fight against terrorism on Thursday and Friday is, okay, we're going to enhance information sharing. And then 2 pages of all the stuff of enhanced information sharing you're going to make in the coming days. Well, we don't need enhanced information sharing. We need mandatory information sharing the fastest as possible. And that is my plea to the European Commission. Is it not possible for the European Commission to come forward with what I call a horizontal mandatory sharing of information clause? You could do it by a regulation, for example. And that means horizontal, that it should apply to all databases that we possess. That can be Schengen Information System, that can be ECRIS, that can be the Europol databases, that can be the Frontex databases, and the 28 new PNR databases. Why is it not possible that in one regulation you say from now on there is a horizontal, mandatory sharing of information clause between all these databases in Europe? And that is my second point. And my third point, my last point, is about the point naturally of Mr. Kamall. I don't know when he's playing Mr. Jekyll or Mr. Hyde, when he is a British Conservative or as an ECR chairman. Well, on Brexit, my appeal is, Mr. Kamall, to look at it in a positive way, in a constructive way, in an offensive way, and not in a defensive way. It is, in my opinion, an opportunity to reform Europe. So let's add to the 4 requests of the British government all the in-depth reforms we desperately need in Europe. A new governance for the Eurozone, new tools in the geopolitical challenges we face. Yeah, why not a defence community? I agree with the Prime Minister, Mr. Cameron, when he is refusing an ever closer union. We don't need an ever closer union, we need desperately a federal union. That's very clear between the European member states. That is what we need. So I agree with him. And then finally, to Mr. Weber, it's true, there were good things in 2015 either, and we have made progress. But for the hell's sake, let's make 2016 better than 2015 to make Europe great. Thank you.
Herr Verhofstadt,
Mr. Verhofstadt, colleague CARVER would like to ask a question.
Once you've stopped waving your arms around all over the place doing an excellent impersonation of a skydiving octopus, won't you perhaps stop to consider the use of your word EU project? Don't you understand, sir, that this isn't some classroom project, but actually the lives and aspirations of 500 million people from 28 very different countries? Don't you understand, Mr. Verhofstadt, that you're playing games without frontiers? C'est juste en frontier.
So I can no longer play octopus. Maybe a shark is better then for you? Could be better to eat you up, yeah? Okay, but that's it. It's very clear that the people in Europe, the 500 million citizens in Europe, know very well that their future is not by retreating back behind national borders. The world of tomorrow will be a world dominated by China, India, the US, the Russian Federation. And if we want to play a role, we're going to do it together or not at all.
Okay. Vielen Dank. Das Wort.
Thank you. I now give the floor for the United Left to the chair, Mrs. Zimmer. Mr. Juncker, you said rightly it will never be simple in Europe. It's never been simple, and it won't be in the future either. However, I'm convinced that if now the member states are suddenly asked to give up their rights of sovereignty to form a European common border agency which can act against their will, and if that is backed up with the threat that those who don't agree will lose their entitlement to the Schengen area, I don't think that is constructive or will contribute to trust between member states. Experience of recent years shows, however, that we often speak with a forked tongue. We make statements on the one hand, make claims, make promises, crank up the pressure, or blackmail member states, force them to undermine their own constitution, to comply finally with the EU institutions' calls. All this prompts me to ask, what are we actually doing? How far has this got? Are we really en route to making the EU and the political and social situation more stable, or are we charging off in the direction of more and more contradictions that people are faced with? I think we need to try and pursue a common path forward, and I would appeal categorically to Council to ensure that during the Council summit meeting the promises which have been made in the past summit should actually be honoured. That's the hotspots. That's making available adequate manpower to do all this. I'm thinking of Greece, but I'm also thinking of the pledges made for the relocation of people who have ended up in those countries. If there are only 34 people arriving in Luxembourg, how honest is that? We can't say that Greece has to fulfill the rules and put in place the measures, but then we leave Greece in the lurch when there's a major crisis of immigration. From what I've heard about keeping the Turkish accession process open, well, we all applauded. Representatives of Bundestag political parties here also applauded. When we say we should be honest, that they don't have any chance of that. But then, in that case, why do we have these agreements which are meant to resolve the refugee crisis whilst turning a blind eye to what Turkey is doing internally with regard to journalists or repression in Kurdish areas. We accept Turkish authorities deciding on whether to put them in detention centres or send them back to Syria. What is going on? How can we stand here and say that we want to open up the next accession chapter, or that we'll open it? Let's be honest then. There'll never be EU member states. And I wonder how far things have got. Are we being honest, or are we just trying to ensure that our interests, or the interests of the big ones, are asserted? What does that have to do with our vision of a just Europe and a just European Union? That doesn't seem to bother us. That's the sort of union I would not like to see. Mr. Coburn wants to ask a question, Mrs. Timmer. Are you in agreement? Mr. Coburn. Go ahead, sir.
Madame, it seems to me that you fear Mr. Verhofstadt's pan-European state police as much as I do, which it seems to be set up to cover up the EU's disastrous immigration policy. Would you agree with me on that, madam?
Ich habe ein erhebliches Problem.
I have a really big problem, as I said, with how we deal with states' sovereignty, but personally it wasn't anything to do with the refugee situation. On behalf of the Greens, the Chair, Mr. Lamberts.
Fellow members, Europe is the world champion at something, not finishing what it started. We had a federal single currency without a federal government with a federal budget. And now we've realised that that's not working. So we're suddenly rushing to deal with the things that we forgot to do before. We have an area for freedom of movement, but as with the single currency, something that we say, yes, this is very important to us, but we don't actually come up with the common management that we need, not only of borders, but also of migration and asylum policy. I'm a Green, perhaps I'm a bit naive. I was naively hoping that the Commission might have made a proposal yesterday that would have been a significant step forward to help us deal with the problem. A step that might help us all as Schengen member states to take a decision to give a European agency a clear role for border monitoring and the appropriate resources to do that. Because if we're talking about border monitoring, we're talking about registering asylum seekers and migrants and resettling them. If we're combating organised crime too, people traffickers and so on, we would need significant resources. But no, we get a proposal which basically boils down to setting up an emergency intervention force to help member states who are overwhelmed by an influx of asylum seekers and migrants. A situation that we have indeed seen, and we do need to help member states. Of course we do. But if you look at what it says in the proposal, it says that this force could be deployed without a request from the member state concerned. And if you carry on reading, it is under the responsibility of the member state. In other words, you're a member state. You see a troop of border police coming in, taking over, managing your border without you having asked them to do it. And just imagine for a moment that European law is infringed, or there are human rights infringements. That is then the responsibility of the member state that has not requested that that force should have intervened. So I see a major danger there of undermining basic legal system. So I think we need to have more feasible proposals. President Juncker, I'd like to remind you of one of your commitments that you've restated several times in this House. We need to have a legal path to give access to Europe. If you want to do away with migrant smugglers and deaths on the high seas, you need that legal path, but it's not in the proposal. Do not forget that President Tusk wrote about 10 days ago that we could perfectly well envisage an 18-month imprisonment for irregular migrants. So there's more than a nuance separating him from your liberal friend Mr. Trudeau. And picking up on what Gabriele ZIMMER said about Turkey, it looks like you're rolling out the red carpet for Mr. Erdogan whilst slamming the door in Putin's face. There's imprisonment of journalists, police and judges are imprisoned if they don't do what he asks them to do. Journalists are persecuted. What's left of the justice system is being used to declare war on his own people. But we say salam alaikum because we want to do a deal on refugees. Last point. There's an agreement that we're very pleased about from Paris last week. Yes. Don't underestimate the importance of that agreement. We've always been at the forefront of this area in the EU. Any European policy adopted here has been based on the idea that we need to limit climate change to 2 degrees. What has been agreed in Paris is well below that, and the closest as we can get to 1.5 degrees. That means right now we need to revise EU policy in order to meet that target, because otherwise we won't. Thank you very much.
Mr. Lambert, Mr. Belinsky would like to ask your question.
Mr. Lambert, one of the issues which is continuously being swept under the carpet is the labour mobility package. You have pointed to the danger of avoiding problems that then come up into our face. Would you support the proposal for a key debate on the whole range of such issues, because it is obvious that if we are talking about a properly functioning internal market, if we are talking about avoiding the dire problems of social injustice, we need a very serious and involved debate with the full participation of the President of the Commission and all other responsible functionaries.
I totally agree with you, Mr. Pirinsky. I note that in my own country, and I think it's the case in France, that if you look at the effects of social dumping, freedom of movement of workers is allowing these effects to take place, and I feel that that is part of the key to the rise of parties like the Front National in France. This is a major problem for many of our citizens, and we do have to find a solution. The solution, however, cannot be one that runs counter to freedom of movement of workers. I think that is one of the fundamental principles of the EU. We need to take account of the interests of countries that are seen traditionally as developed and countries in other parts of the world. So there's no simple solution to that, but it's an urgent discussion, and I deplore the fact that the Commission has once again postponed it.
On behalf of the EFDD, I give the floor to Chairman Farage.
Another European summit and yet another power grab. It's funny, every single time a European Union policy fails, and that's pretty often, the demand is more centralisation and more Europe. And I think by any measure, the EU's common asylum policy, albeit given rocket boosters by Chancellor Merkel, has been a dramatic failure. Not only will millions continue to come, few of whom, of course, would qualify as genuine refugees, but it's become an open invitation to terrorism. So our solution is that the EU Border Agency and the EU Maritime Services should be given powers and the ability to declare force majeure over the member states. And incredibly, the British Prime Minister, David Cameron, is supporting this. And yet, that's the same Prime Minister who is going in to have a meeting with you tomorrow night to talk about our so-called renegotiation. I hope he fares better than last time. The last time he attempted this, he got to speak at 1 o'clock in the morning, spoke for a total of 7 minutes, during the middle of which the French President, Monsieur Hollande, got up and went out for a pee. So I hope they take him a bit more seriously this time, though I sense that nobody in this room is exactly quaking in their boots. After all, he has asked for almost nothing and is unlikely to even get that. But I'm sure we'll be treated to the usual theatricals. A grave-faced Prime Minister will come back to Britain to say how tough the negotiations have been, to say that he will not give in, and there'll be hints that perhaps the Prime Minister will even support Brexit if he doesn't get his way. I think we should take that about as seriously as when he banged the table and said he would not pay the 1.75 billion sterling surcharge 18 months ago, and yet then meekly obliged. In February, the charade will come back. There'll be a European summit, and on something minor and inconsequential, there'll be a deal, and a referendum will happen in June 2016. Opposition to this project is growing right across the continent. 15% now of the Hungarian population have signed a petition against migrant quotas. We saw an extraordinary advance in the French National Front in the elections in France last week, but so far nobody has reached the tipping point. Well, the British referendum may be that moment, and the momentum is on our side. It isn't just about getting back national democracy, it's actually about getting back national self-confidence. And I think for those of us that believe in nation-state democracy, 2016 is a very bright dawn indeed. Thank you.
Monsieur Farage, il y a une demande de carton bleu.
Mr. Farage, there's a blue card.
Monsieur Lucke. Microphone.
Hello. Wenn das britische Volk ihre Ansichten teilt,
If the British people was going to share its views on the EU and your views on the EU and your views on Cameron, how come UKIP hasn't got more than one seat in Westminster?
Mr. Lucke, as you may or may not understand, we have a very odd electoral system in the United Kingdom, but I would remind you, in the European elections, UKIP won those elections. And right across the continent, we are seeing the centre, the left and the right, genuine opposition to the European project growing. The disappointment, Mr. Lucke, is that people like you in Germany, who've been critical of so many aspects of the Union, of so much about the euro, appear not to have the courage to logically follow through your own convictions and to conclude that this project is the wrong project, and what we want is a Europe of democratic nation states trading together, being friends together, but without the flag, without the anthem, without the Commission and without the European Parliament.
La parole est à Monsieur Ferrand, au nom du groupe.
Mr. Ferrand, on behalf of the ENF group, for 1.5 minutes. Ladies and gentlemen, courage subsides. That could be the topic for the next European Council. Claims to fight terrorism are made by the heads of state and government, but hundreds, even thousands of terrorists are entering amidst the migratory flows. Most of the killers of the 13th of November came into Europe that way, such as their leader who came in through Greece. The Schengen Treaty is the origin of our problems, and you want to take a failed system further today. The same applies for EMU. The Council intends to strengthen EMU, even though it's a crying failure. Only a policy geared to the needs of each member state with an organised exit from the euro will allow the peoples of Europe to avoid austerity, recession and sacrifices. The next issue, Brexit, might jeopardise your suicidal choices. The European peoples will speak in each member state in their own elections. Ladies and gentlemen, Europeans don't want your technocratic, ultra-liberal, cosmopolitan Europe anymore. Europeans want a Europe of nations and freedoms. That's the only solution for a genuine future for European civilization. Mrs. Dodds, 1.5 minutes.
President, the Council of Ministers meeting this week is viewed with a great deal of interest in the United Kingdom, and many view it as a serious test of whether these institutions are capable of change and reform. A few weeks ago, David Cameron published his agenda for negotiation. It is an agenda without ambition and very far removed from his stated aims for renegotiation in his Bloomberg speech of 2013. Back then, he promised opt-outs from EU legislation, control over migration, curbs on the European courts, and fundamentally he demanded treaty change. Today he has limited himself to so-called changes that merely reflect the status quo and a vague demand for greater competitiveness within the single market. His proposals around benefit uptake have met with fierce resistance. So is this union up for negotiation? Are the European institutions capable of change? Or, as many of my constituents believe, are we simply left to pay the bill while having our concerns ignored? It is a stern test for David Cameron. It is an even bigger test for Brussels. And the scant reference to this in both the Commission and Council contributions this morning does not bode well. Many in the UK have already decided, with the polls showing growing numbers opting for Brexit. Members, the ball is in your court.
Madame Dodds.
Mrs. Dodds, there's a blue card. Will you accept it?
Monsieur Lamberts.
Ms. Dodds, I heard what you said. I think that your Prime Minister has cornered himself by asking things that he knows pretty well cannot be achieved, especially in terms of freedom of circulation. I believe that the real question that the British people have to answer is whether they believe that they will be stronger on their own, being 1% of the global population, albeit with Trident submarines, not sure it gives you a lot, or by sharing sovereignty to be part of a bloc that can really have influence in this world. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. If I may say so, the very question sort of mirrors the attitude of the institutions towards the British renegotiation issue. It is a matter of dilution, dilution, dilution until you give nothing. That has the effect in the United Kingdom of growing the numbers for Brexit. You can choose which way it will go.
Niebler pour 1 minute 30.
1.5 minutes for Mrs. Niebler. You have the floor.
Madame Niebler. Verehrte Frau Präsidentin.
President of the Commission and the Council, dear colleagues, the signal that we will be issuing from the summit tomorrow and the day after signifies the beginning of the new year. Will we see a group in dispute, we all playing our individual games and at the end we all lose, or will we see people who stand together and look to the future and decide to fight together? The Commission is fighting for a united Europe, and we in the European Parliament also by the majority, and also the President in Office of the Council. I'd like to thank the Commission because they always emphasize what we have in common and they work for a strong Europe. And we hear constructive proposals being put forward as we face huge challenges. Also, when we look at yesterday, and we're talking about the Border and Coast Guard. Schengen was mentioned, and it's one of our main achievements. We see people traveling in the Schengen area without any checks. We assume that our borders are safe and that people are registered as they enter the Schengen area. It's true that we see huge pressures on the external borders, that members are asking for help in order to ensure the safety of our borders, and they need cooperation. But we're also talking about the cooperation of a border and coast guard jointly. But put pressure on people, make sure that you're used to the process so that the member states stand together so we achieve this kind of Europe. Thank you.
Niebler.
Mrs. Niebler, please listen to me. There's a blue card for you. Mr. KORWIN-MIKKE. Will you accept Mr. KORWIN-MIKKE's blue card? He's over there.
Monsieur Korwin-Mikke. Oui. Oui, allez-y, monsieur.
Go ahead, sir.
In 1933, Liechtenstein refused to join the Third Reich. I understand that if it were a part of the Third Reich, it would have been much more powerful and it would have had more opportunities. Right now, Liechtenstein refused to join the EU. I understand they have terrible difficulties and poverty reigns there. Would you recommend that Liechtenstein joins the EU? Thank you.
Dear colleague, at the moment that is not really a relevant question. It's up to Liechtenstein what they want, and we should just be looking to the future. We've had a difficult year in 2015, and we hope for the best, and we have done our utmost in the European Parliament to cope with the crisis. We're now looking forward so that we can ensure that we can do what the citizens of Europe expect from us, so that we can produce progress in our common Europe, and we can help the people who are in need who arrive here.
Monsieur Guerrero Salom, pour 2 minutes.
Mr. Guerrero Salom, 2 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam President. In 2015, the European Council has changed its main focus several times. At the beginning of the year, the Greek crisis was the main focus. Terrorism, Charlie Hebdo in the summer, the refugee crisis, the migrant crisis, and then we had the terrorism crisis. So there's been a change of focus constantly. But the crises didn't disappear. They were all still there. And they're all still there. So it may appear that we're not as dramatically concerned about one or the other crisis, but they are still there. What about the economic crisis and the jobs crisis? That's still there too for the citizens of Europe. And if you look at the crisis in terms of unemployment, it is going to have a major impact on young people and the long-term unemployed. If you look at social and territorial divergences, disparities, loss of rights, loss of labour rights, and loss of wage conditions, it's a major issue. We have weak growth at present, 1.5% approximately, half of the US is. We have high unemployment, around 11%, twice the US is. We're not really getting geared up for the future. We have a very high investment gap too. In 2015 we did less than in 2014, and in 2014 we did less than in 2013. So we need to deal with the economic crisis urgently, because it's not going to go away. A question for the Commission. I support the Commission, but I would like to ask the following question. Is it the case that following the September and November summits, at which 160,000 resettlements were agreed upon, is it the case that only 100 have taken place? Because if that is the case, that should be a source of shame to Member States.
Fotyga, 1 minute.
1 minute, Mrs. Fotyga.
Dziękuję. Thank you very much, Madam President. We have worked out a proper strategy, but its implementation is lagging behind. This is a quotation from Mr. Tusk's letter inviting everyone for the meeting of the European Council. His agenda contains many reasonable proposals like PNR, but I do not think that the idea of creating the European Border and Coast Guard is a reasonable idea, because this would undermine the constitutional setup of a few member states. It is also quite doubtful in relation to the basis of the European Union. We should not count on this replacing the solidarity between member states, and the member states are responsible for security.
Thank you, Madam Chair. President Juncker, a couple of months ago, while referring to the European Council conclusions on the enhancement of the mandate for Frontex, I was very critical. and I expected much more. And I need to applaud you today, President, that you have delivered something that is much more significant. And I think this is an answer to the concern of the citizens that say we want Schengen and we want security inside Schengen. And I think that this is a proper proposal. We now expect the Council that it will deliver this week and it will approve it. Of course, this is one leg. I would like to see in the future the second leg, because talking about capacities, whether 1,000 plus 1,500 is sufficient or not, we will have to see. But I'm sure that we will need in the future capacities of military integrated forces. This is another element, this is a second foot we should be looking forward to in the future. Final remark, and that is on the sharing of information. The terrorist that was stopped at the Belgian border was covered by one database on property, basically delict, but he was also in the Europol database with connections to terrorist organizations. We failed. We need to connect these. This is the task for the immediate future. Thank you.
Merci. La parole est à Monsieur Couso-Permuy.
Thank you, Mr. Couso-Permuy. 2 minutes.
Thank you, President. This European Council is moving in the wrong direction, the same direction that we saw in the State of the Union debate and the neighbourhood policy debate. It's just making a fatal crisis worse. People talk about a migrant crisis. It's a refugee crisis, the most significant one since the Second World War. Refugees are fleeing war, and we have a lot of responsibility for that war. We have been following other interests, the interests of those who want a destabilized Mediterranean and the Mashrek on fire. And that won't be solved by building walls to protect us. It won't be resolved by having a super police force that is above and beyond the national police force. It won't be resolved by supporting supposed allies such as Turkey, who are engaged in oil trading with Daesh. It won't be resolved by invading Iraq and under a NATO umbrella engaging in provocation against a neighbouring nuclear power such as Russia. We will also need cooperation to deal with economic asymmetries. Terrorism cannot be combated by eliminating our freedoms in the EU with asymmetrical proposals, military solutions and states of emergency. We need to ensure that the rule of law is protected and that we do not have allies who support Wahhabism, and we need to ensure that the international legal framework is protected. The lack of solidarity in Greece, destroying freedom when faced with a threat and having an unjust economy, all of this is a further nail in the coffin of the EU, which appears not to care about its citizens.
There's a blue card for you, sir. Will you accept it? Mr. Storer.
Ja, voorzitter, dank u wel. Ik zou graag aan mijn collega willen vragen.
Thank you. I'd like to ask a question. We've heard a great deal about the acceptance of refugees or victims of war. What personal responsibility do you have, colleague? How many refugees have you taken into your home?
La responsabilidad personal.
Personal responsibility and political responsibility. Political responsibility is defending the right to asylum, not the right to hatred, which is what you defend.
1 minute.
1 minute, Mrs. Evans.
Thank you, President. At a date yet to be announced, my constituents in Wales will be faced with a choice that will affect us for generations to come, voting on whether or not to remain in the European Union. For my party, Plaid Cymru, and for many in Wales, like local authorities, businesses and voluntary organisations, EU membership is vital in building our economy and our communities. Wales has benefited from EU solidarity through the structural funds and from legislation protecting workers, the environment and our rural areas, and much more. I know that Wales has a great deal to contribute to making the EU more effective, improving Europe for all our peoples. We want to engage far more directly, positively and proactively. We want to work together in the interests of peace, social justice and sustainability. There may be no decision taken this week in relation to the UK, but I want to send a strong message that we'll be making a very clear and positive case for remaining in the EU in Wales's interest and Europe's interests.
Carte bleue, est-ce que vous l'acceptez?
You have a blue card. Will you accept it, Ms Evans?
J'accepte le blue card, Monsieur Coburn.
Mrs Evans, considering your party, the Welsh Nationalists, are doing so badly in the polls in Wales, and UKIP are doing so well, and it looks like we're going to get a lot of representation in Wales, wouldn't you say the Welsh people agree more with UKIP than with you?
What we need and what we are leading in Wales is a very factual and very honest debate on where the interests of the people of Wales lie. That has been shown clearly time and time again to be in the EU as a small, successful nation with a strong economy. I have yet to hear UKIP put forward any policies that will benefit people in Wales.
La parole est à Monsieur Borrelli.
Mr Borrelli, 2 minutes.
Thank you, President. Amidst increasing tension and external pressure, Europe has no choice but to return to economic growth and resolve the ambiguity inherent in its cultural identity. The economic crisis has triggered a slide into poverty of what was once the middle classes. Short-sighted austerity policies have not allowed the alleviation of the suffering of the many by means of immediate, simple solidarity measures such as the citizens' income. Such tension, such centrifugal forces could have been avoided had there been more understanding shown of the devastating social effects of austerity policies. The crisis has pulled Europe out of shape, and now, never weaker, Europe is investing huge resources into defences against terrorist attack and migratory pressure. But it's not doing enough to achieve the principal solution, which is economic growth. Growth creates breathing room for everyone. If there's no growth, borders will keep on closing. Then you've got the question of cultural identity. Cultures are so diverse, they haven't gelled to form a whole greater than the sum of its parts. If anything, it's something less than the sum of its parts. A scared and fragmented society. A Europe that's uncertain of its common good. That's a Europe that from within generates the seeds of radicalism, which are ever harder to fight. Efforts this year to enhance growth are falling short. In some areas, inequalities are on the rise. We need more thought to go to the shared challenges of our industrial policy. Our industrial policy must be more than services and digital. It must above all focus on manufacturing. That's why we want to urge this summit to get back real political vision and the moral impetus to convince and involve people, so our fellow citizens can see the EU doing something for them too. Thank you.
Mr de Graaff, 1 minute.
Voorzitter,
President, the summit on combating terrorism is being proposed that we should have special programs as an alternative, for example, to prisons or imprisonment. This proposal, we see that Canada showing respect for people, and we of course respect the victims of Bataclan and victims of other terrible acts. People are talking about veterans here. This is madness, and this is endangering the safety of our citizens. We're not talking about veterans, these terrorists. They are simply spreading terror via Islam. I think that the European summit should decide to throw them out and let's preserve our borders.
Mr. Synadinos, 1 minute.
Madam President, the implementation of decisions to deal with migratory flows is the final nail in the coffin of Europe of solidarity and joint decision-making. The elected or non-elected representatives cannot find solutions. They were caught unprepared in dealing with the economic crisis of Greece, and they actually proposed the exit of Greece from the Eurozone with a non-paper tabled by Mr. Schäuble. Some people have even discussed the exit of Greece from Schengen. We have so many jihadists in Europe, and you decided to offer 3 billion to Turkey, which hosts these people. So close the door to Turkey and you will solve all your problems. We always try to find scapegoats and people to accuse. The countries of Europe, you should know that, can only deal with this menace if they have nationalistic governments. Thank you very much.
SARYUSZ-WOLSKI, per un minuto.
Mr. SARYUSZ-WOLSKI, 1 minute 30.
As the EU Council will address the issue of energy union, I would like to quote the EPP group position on the matter, voted unanimously in our recent strategic position paper on the external dimension of energy security. I quote, "We, the EPP Group, believe that the Nord Stream 2 agreement is not in line with the EU strategy of diversification of sources of supply and routes of transit of imported energy, as well as the EU's energy security strategy and foreign security and Eastern Partnership policy goals, reinforcing the EU's dependency on Russian gas supply." End of quote. My comment: Nord Stream 2 is being pursued by the Commission as a purely commercial project. My question is a project negotiated in person by President of Russia Putin and Vice Chancellor of a Member State, is such a project a purely commercial one? The European Commission considers that Nord Stream requires just and only legal analysis. This is fundamentally wrong. It is a geopolitical project that can be detrimental to our security. It contradicts energy security strategy, energy union itself, foundations of our foreign security and Eastern Neighbourhood Partnership policy goals. It is in breach of European solidarity and against the spirit of Russia's sanctions. It is harmful to the interests of Ukraine, Belarus, Poland and Slovakia, and can be a political game changer, reinforcing the power position of one single gas supplier, reinforcing the Union's dependence and further exposing Eastern Member States and their Eastern neighbours to Russia's pressure and blackmail. Thank you.
Mr. SARYUSZ-WOLSKI, there is a blue card for you. Do you want to answer? Mr. Zani.
Thank you. I'm very glad that my colleague brought up this topic. It is indeed one of the most burning issues. Although in the EPP there is one government party, Fidesz in Hungary, led by Mr. Orbán, who constantly has a private business with Mr. Putin and is stepping out of the line. How do you treat this? How do you tackle this in the People's Party?
On energy policy, we think that the Hungarian government is not in line with EPP priorities, both in terms of its atomic enterprise deal with Russia and also in terms of position on general line on Russia, but it does not concern the issue which I did raise, which is Nord Stream 2. Thank you.
Onorevole Telička, non posso concedere il carton blu.
I'm afraid we cannot have another blue card because we're running late and we have the Sakharov Prize at midday. So I'm afraid I will have to ask you all to stick to the time limits and please restrict requests for blue cards, because otherwise we risk not concluding our debate in time. Ms. Fajon, 2 minutes.
Hvala lepa, predsedujoči. Spoštovani plenum.
Thank you, President. Ladies and gentlemen, it is clear that we are faced with major problems because member states are not implementing measures intended to attenuate migratory pressures. The detailed examination of the different proposals, if we look at resettlement, returns for those who are not entitled to international protection, identification of individuals on entering the Union, all of these are very ambitious proposals, but we don't have the detail as to how to implement them. Enhancing external borders is easy to say, but how can we enhance our barbed wire fences around my countries? There's growing mistrust, and this idea that we should do everything alone means that we are finding we're not equipped to deal with new flows of migrants. So we need clear management, and Western Balkan countries will be unable to cope soon with this pressure of migrants. Financial assistance will be necessary. There are over 2 million refugees in Turkey, and we can't see any end to the conflict in Syria anytime soon. So we need to strengthen external borders and provide assistance to countries on the Balkan route in order for the Schengen area to survive. Any attempt to create a mini Schengen would be far too dangerous to Europe. Freedom of movement has a symbolic value in Europe. Europe will only survive if we can show solidarity and humanity. We no longer have a Europe of solidarity. We have a Europe of indifference at present. We are losing our hope, and we should do better in 2016. For that reason, I call on the European Council to do its utmost to meet all the commitments so that Schengen as we know it can survive.
There is a blue card for you. Do you want to answer? Mr. Jakovčić, you have the floor.
Thank you for having accepted the blue card. Mrs. Fajon, I would like to ask you something rather simple. You speak about the need of free movement, about solidarity, about the need that we show mutual respect for each other, for our values. I agree with you that there are certain problems that we have with migrants, but would you agree with me that setting up razor barbed wire that the Slovenian government has put up all the way to the Adriatic Sea, especially in the region where migrants will never appear, and this is in the region of Istria and Gorski Kotar, do you really feel that this is necessary?
I hate seeing these barbed wire fences going up on our borders. I hate it just as much as you do. I think it's bad for people on both sides of the border, but I think it's a consequence of inaction by politicians in our near neighbourhood too, in countries such as Hungary. And I stress, we can only deal with this situation by acting together. We should all do our utmost to ensure that Schengen as we know it can survive.
Thank you. Tomorrow, European leaders will discuss the single market, migration and Brexit. British voters are split 50-50. The single market has made it easier to trade in 28 countries with 500 million consumers, and I would like to see it more dynamic. But unless substantial changes are made, Britain will vote to leave. The UK will not join the euro. It cannot be part of the ever closer union or the social pillar, and it is vital that countries outside the eurozone cannot be discriminated against by a cartel of those within. This is a key point in the British negotiation. On migration, the region I represent has experienced more EU migration than any other part of the UK. Free movement is a cherished right, but unlimited access to healthcare welfare has proved unsustainable and builds resentment. In 2 years' time, Britain may well have voted to leave. I urge leaders, please, to listen carefully to our requests and try to make progress.
La parola all'onorevole de SARNEZ.
Ms. de SARNEZ, 1 minute.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, President. It's quite clear that Europe needs to regain its ability to act. A lot of time has been lost. It's more than urgent. Of course, we need to be able to control our own borders. That debate is becoming surreal. That's manifest. If we can't do that, Schengen will die off. And Schengen goes hand in hand with the control of external borders. All major world powers work on that basis. We've been calling for a border and coast guard force for years. I hope we go in that direction. Yes, we need a harmonised European asylum policy. Where's that going? What about the revision of Dublin, which requires overhaul? What about the list of safe countries, which has still not been tabled, even though we've been talking about it for months on end? Lastly, to go very quickly, yes, the EU needs to work on an end to the crisis in Syria politically, but that political outcome requires prospects to be offered from that country. However, we won't do that unless there's a shared political will between the Commission and all Member States.
Madame de SARNEZ, il y a un carton.
Ms. de SARNEZ, there's a blue card for you. Will you respond?
Grazie, Presidente. Madame de SARNEZ.
Ms. de SARNEZ, it was a proposal earlier for an anti-terrorist agency to be put forward by Mr. Verhofstadt. What do you think of that proposal? Is it a good one? Should we actually do that at the end of the day, given the terrorist attacks that we've seen recently in Europe?
Yes, sir, indeed. Terrorists are playing off the different borders, and we clearly have work to do together. We must step up and enhance cooperation between all the intelligence services. There must be mandatory sharing of sensitive data. I would also add that we must pool the files on foreign fighters. That does not obtain yet at the moment I'm talking.
Ahora la palabra es el señor González Peña.
Ms. González Peñas, 2 minutes. Thank you. Mr. Juncker said it's a time of change. I certainly agree with that, although we may not agree on what we mean by that. We need a change in the European model. We need a social model with the founding values of democracy, welfare and social rights. We need a change in foreign policy too. It should be based on democracy, human rights and development. It is our responsibility to design a policy to welcome refugees who are fleeing war and terror. Humanitarian measures along those lines would meet with our support, but the solution to the refugee crisis and the terrorism crisis is something that will require stability in the Middle East. And we're seeing centrist and centre-right politicians competing with the far right to eliminate our rights and freedoms. We need peace and democracy across the Middle East, and we need to achieve that through politics, not through instruments of war. If we want to combat Euroscepticism and cynicism about the European project, we cannot see the EU continuing to be a synonym for mass impoverishment and austerity. We have very high unemployment across the EU. 10% of workers are poor. This kind of cosmetic adjustment to policy is not enough. We need to strengthen our social policy, move away from strengthening the EMU, make the ECB democratic, have jobs created through an ambitious public investment programme, so that resources are used to create millions of jobs in the green economy, new technology, carers, public services. The European socialists can choose between the path of Jeremy Corbyn, going for a social Europe, or going for peace in the Middle East, or continuing to support policies that concentrate wealth in the hands of a few in Europe whilst the many have to suffer the consequences.
Ora la parola l'onorevole Keller per un minuto.
Ms. Keller, 1 minute.
Thank you. Vice President Timmermans has said yesterday that the problem that we have in Europe is the many irregular entries and that those need to be stopped. But those people who are coming irregularly are refugees. And refugees are in need of protection, and refugees are not the problem we have in Europe. The problem that we have is the distribution of refugees and the lack of solidarity. And we cannot turn refugees away if we're to follow our own laws and our own morals. But this is exactly what the Commission is not proposing to do with the new Frontex mandate, because Frontex, in coordination and cooperation with third countries, will make sure that those people in need of protection will never make it to the European shores. And this is already happening. But in future, the closing of the borders will even be mandatory for member states. Member states who don't close their borders completely will be punished. And on the other hand, we see a resettlement proposal. Very nice, but resettlement will be voluntary. Why is it that Europe can always agree to make closing borders mandatory, but when it's about welcoming refugees, that's up to every member state to see if they want to? I think this proposal of the Commission is simply a new troika, this time for the borders, and this is not the face I want to see of Europe. Thank you.
Please, we need to respect the timing because there is the prize sacro thing. Thank you very much. Voglio salutare.
I would like to welcome a group of young firefighters from Korčula Island and elsewhere in Croatia. They were working very hard this summer, saved a lot of lives fighting fires, so welcome and thank you for your work.
La parola all'onorevole
Mr. Paksas, 2 minutes.
President, Commission President, colleagues, the European Council agenda will be long, but I would like to ask on this occasion on a different subject. Can it be constructive? And this is why. The intention is to focus on the main topics without focusing really on the main ones. Perhaps because we cannot find the common denominator that could be used to determine the major topic, which is that refugees, the Brexit referendum, or maybe the things in the euro area, maybe the situation in Syria or the Ukraine, migration crisis, EU-Russia relations, Nord Stream 2, or the UK proposals on the reforms in the EU. Given the communication of the Commission, the Council will focus on all the aspects of the single market. It will also talk about the digital market, the energy union, capital union. I think that the Council agenda should be much more concrete and should be devoted just to a couple of issues. And the problem number one today is the migration crisis. And in this aspect, we should look for the best answers and solutions how to deal with it. We're not happy with the quotas. Let's look for another options. We don't like border controls. Let's suggest other solutions. The problem with the Brexit, let's find rational solutions. But gathering together once again and shedding tears on the problems without any solutions, that is cheating the society. Thank you.
Vilimsky per un minuto.
Mr. Vilimsky, 1 minute.
Grazie, Presidente. Meine sehr geehrten
Thank you. Terrorism is affecting Europe. We see our currencies collapsing, and we see an access and a flow of people that is unbelievable, and heads of state seem to just looking at a lack of planning, and people are just sort of wandering around without developing any kind of plan. We can't all have everybody coming in, then we close the borders, then the borders are reopened, then they say Schengen is not functioning, then we get Schengen back. Then but now, at least they have agreed that there should be a protection of our borders on the east. I think that's cautiously positive, but if we can't protect our identity, if we can't protect our cultures, then Europe is going to fail. And you will be causing all this chaos, and you will be taking the identity of Europe to the grave. Thank you.
Onorevole Korwin-Mikke, lei ha già fatto una blue card.
Mr. Korwin-Mikke, you did have a blue card earlier. You did speak earlier, so I cannot give you a second blue card because we are really pressed for time. Next time, Mr. Gollnisch, 1 minute.
The European Council of the 17th and 18th of December will look once again at the problems of terrorism and mass immigration. The attacks in France and the influx of 1 million refugees has been required for the bureaucracy in Brussels to realise how porous Europe's borders were, but that awareness doesn't extend inwardly. How much credibility can we attach to your proposals, therefore? Mr. Juncker said that we need to strike a balance between security and freedom, but some measures are more dangerous towards freedom than they are effective towards security. I'm thinking about the systematic computerized exploitation of passenger name record data, which can be given on request to third country who have completely different interests. Or what about arms imports, which of course will hardly affect terrorists? They don't ask the local police station if they're allowed to have their Kalashnikov. Terrorism can prosper within the European Union, and without consultation of citizens, the European Union has facilitated that.
Mr. Lamassoure, 1 minute 30. Thank you, President. Yes to a European border and coast guard. Yes to strengthening Europol. Yes to helping Turkey, Jordan, Lebanon to welcome and care for refugees. Yes to help Africa following the EU-Africa summit in Valletta. After COP21, we need to help states in Africa to deal with migration, terrorism, to develop their economies and protect the environment. So yes to everything. But who's going to pay for it? How are we going to pay for it? We're talking about EU competences, we're talking about EU decisions, community decisions, but the EU budget is gone. There's nothing left in the coffers. Our multi-annual financial framework is decided on for a period of 7 years, and that means we have a framework based on yesterday's priorities rather than today's emergencies. That means we're faced with a dilemma. Do we plunge into the cohesion funds and hit the poorest regions hardest, or do we do what we appear to be doing now, which is to create ad hoc funds, trust funds, small spin-off budgets with no effective oversight, including in national parliaments? I think that's an unacceptable dilemma. Next year we should revise the multi-annual financial framework, and let's take that opportunity to think about the underlying principle. We have an over-rigid framework. We cannot build Europe by sacrificing the poor on the one hand or sacrificing democracy on the other.
Monsieur Lamassoure,
Mr. Lamassoure, there's a blue card for you. Are you willing to respond?
Monsieur Mavrides.
Mr. Mavrides.
Thank you, President. Mr. Lamassoure, I'm right here. I'm going to ask you a question. A few months ago, here in this Parliament, we evaluated the accession of Turkey. And we evaluated the accession of Turkey both internally and externally. And it was disappointing for human rights and, of course, for the continuing occupation, the illegal occupation of Cyprus. Now, due to the influx of refugees, the Commission wants to open up new chapters. I like your opinion on that. Is this consistent with our values and principles? Is this right of what it's about to do for the Commission? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. I think we do indeed need to draw a clear distinction. Turkey needs assistance. We should give that assistance to Turkey to deal with refugees in a humane fashion. The second issue is Turkey's request to join the EU. Mr. Kamal put it very well. Turkey will never join the EU because there will never be the necessary consensus amongst the 28 member states to allow Turkey to join. And I regret the fact that we should be seeing some confusion between those two issues once again now. Mr. Fleckenstein, 2 minutes.
Liebe Kolleginnen und Kollegen.
Colleagues, the plenary chamber is fairly empty, which perhaps reflects our expectations of this council. Mr. Asselborn And Mr. Schmit, I would like to thank you. I can't remember a presidency has had to work so hard and then had to face results that were really not very satisfactory and so little reflected here. And it was not due lack of effort. It's not a good year for the EU. We have tried to look for solutions. We've also found some. And the Council, of course, represents 28 member states. And some people who undermine the EU go back home and then they blame Brussels for everything. That is not a solution. And the best decisions have been taken, but slowly it's not implemented or just fails to. What about the funds? How many of the 160,000 refugees have actually been resettled? What about the many officials who were supposed to Slovenia? What about the hotspots in Greece? It's not enough to have a commissioner traveling to Lesbos and says, this camp is now called a hotspot. It takes more. And I hope that this will be added at some point. There's a lack of shared willingness and there's a lack of management. And that's what we face as we prepare the negotiations with Prime Minister Cameron. He faces a referendum. I warn against this kind of danger occurring in other states. We need to handle this well. We want the UK to stay with the EU because we would be poorer without the EU. But there is a limit to everything. We can't curb freedom of movement. What can we put under competition? There's the old theory that the market regulates everything, but I hope we reach a solution, not because Camera has to have the upper hand, but I keep listening to Mr. Farage, who is not really talking to us, and I listen to the BBC. And maybe everybody, now nobody's here, maybe we could see that on the camera.
Mr. Lucke, 1 minute.
President, ladies and gentlemen, the British Prime Minister has presented his demands for a reform of the EU, and the chair of the Liberals group, who shines in his absence, says that other member states should also table reform proposals. Indeed, there is room for reform. There's the European Central Bank, for example, which should be returned to the tasks that it's meant to have responsibility. Monetary policy. The ECB isn't there to act as a lender to indebted states every month. That's also on the EU reform agenda. Then there's the stabilisation mechanism, which is a entity on the point of collapse. That we should get rid of the clause that it is there for. Well-performing member states like Germany are meant to be punished for their balance of payments surplus. They say that would be anti-competitive. We can't implement that. Every member state should be free to decide on its currency, whether it joins or leaves the euro. Thank you.
Tiene la palabra la...
Ms. Bagasso Urtundua Ruiz has the floor.
Se mueve de cumbre en cumbre.
As we go from summit to summit, it looks like things are happening, but not always. It's just for public opinion. In terms of the real figures for resettlement, we're talking about 200 people, so 0.00 something percent, and people don't talk about that. People are fleeing war and the ravages of war. We don't want to accept that these are people like us. They're stigmatized. There are many countries, including my own, that use excuses in order not to take on board their own quota, and that has consequences. The trust funds too have minimum quantities. The food is running out. They're fleeing Turkish camps. We haven't changed Dublin. Hotspots may become retention camps, but they'll only be effective if we have returns too. Is that the story that we want to tell? Is that the way we would like it to be recorded in the history books? That's my question to the Commission and Council. There is a blue card for you, Madam. Will you respond?
Onorevole Ujazdowski.
Mr. Ujazdowski.
Madam, the majority of the politicians, also the President of the European Council, Donald Tusk, thinks that the relocation system is not valid anymore, but you are repeating the solution is still valid. Don't you think it's better to look for more flexible solutions that will be more effective in reality and not be so stubborn about a solution that has proven to be completely unadjusted to reality and dysfunctional?
The important thing is to look for solutions. We're not being stubborn about this. We're just saying we need to go from words to action. People need to be welcomed. Otherwise, we'll have to say to public opinion that we're just failing to do our duty in terms of international humanitarian law, fundamental values, to welcome those who are fleeing war and say, no, sorry, we can't do it. We can't do this thing that we've promised to do. I'm just saying we should be honest to public opinion.
Onorevole Scott Cato.
Ms. Scott Cato, 1 minute.
I have chosen to speak about the very real risk that my country may soon leave this union. David Cameron wants us to believe his renegotiation vision is the only show in town when it comes to EU reform. His pro-austerity, regulation-light, anti-migration rhetoric is more nightmare than vision, and it appears he now wants to export and inflict this nightmare on the rest of Europe. But it's clear that his fake negotiation is unravelling. His pledge to reduce red tape sees him doing his bit for the corporations, eager to eliminate anything that stands in the way of their profits. And his support for dodgy trade deals like TTIP shows that he is happy to see a race to the bottom on workers' rights, environmental protection and health standards. But many in the UK want to be part of a genuinely reformed Europe, with a stronger, more effective European Parliament, with greater decision-making powers and scrutiny over the Commission and Council. Greens say yes to the EU, yes to real reform, and yes to upholding the rights of all citizens, which Mr Cameron seems so keen to bargain away.
Onorevole Buonanno per un minuto.
Mr. Buonanno, 1 minute.
Thank you very much, President. I think the European Union is a monster. We have created a monster over decades, and this monster is eating, drinking and sleeping, unfortunately. And everybody else is just doing what they like. We go through Europe and we see that there are plenty of countries that are absolutely, for example, without hygiene or even education. But what we need to say that we must eat insects. Well, how can we eat insects? We have wine, milk and drink. They're great. Somebody like Mr. Juncker, fortunately he is gone, because perhaps he had to change his hairstyle or something, but you can't manage the European Union in this way. We have Islamic terrorists who arrive. Well, we should have a European Guantanamo. I will be the director. A European Guantanamo, that's what I would like to see.
La prego anche quando si rivolge al Presidente.
If you're addressing the President of the Commission, please use the appropriate language for this House. Ms. Gardini.
President, I listened to the debate and it put me in mind of a debate that we had in November 2012 with Angela Merkel here, and we were thinking about what the European model went, and we were thinking in terms of a 27 member state EU still. We were about to welcome Croatia in as the latest EU member state. We barely make up 10% of the world population, 20% of GDP, and the majority of social spending. So if we wanted to keep that very expensive model, it obviously required changes. But what we are thinking of today will blow a hole in our bank. It's a social model, and I understand many parts of the world may admire that model, but if we can't support it for the benefit of our citizens, then we won't be able to provide it anymore with the best will in the world. some people have said that they'd like to welcome everyone in, but we need rules. Unfortunately, will have to say that we can only accept within our borders those who are escaping from a situation of war. We need also to support our economy. There's been too much talk about the Paris Agreement. We need to look very carefully at the voluntary commitments made by countries. We need to weigh them up. Otherwise, we will see the competitiveness of our industry slide. It's not going to be an easy job, but we need to deal with this.
Ms. Rodriguez.
The European project is confronted with these several crises, and we really need a paradigm shift to be based on a very clear idea, is that we have reached a point where only real European solutions can work. And it's up to the Commission, to the European Parliament members and to the European Council members to tell this to citizens, and many of them, they can understand this. We have reached this point. When it comes to the need to protect the Schengen area by building up a real European border, when it comes to managing migration and hosting refugees, when it comes to coping with the pressures from big powers such as China, and when it comes to overcoming the Eurozone crisis. And I would like to leave a last remark on the roadmap to complete the economic and monetary union. Because if you want this roadmap to work, you need to make sure that upward economic and social convergence will be properly supported by a banking union and a fiscal capacity.
La parola all'onorevole Tomasic.
Ms. Tomasic, 1 minute.
The migration crisis brought to light huge differences in the attitude of member states towards the reception of migrants. The time has come to finally harmonize these attitudes in order to manage the crisis in a responsible and efficient manner. This upcoming meeting is an ideal opportunity to reach agreement which will guarantee coordination and cooperation instead of a barbed wire at our borders. Slovenia put up a barbed wire at its border with Croatia. It is a unilateral decision that didn't hold back any migrants, but it has caused the mass deaths of wild animals. Our people are now exposed to the images that are hardly appropriate for a civilized Europe. Also, a part of this wire has been placed on the Croatian territory and might become subject to a bilateral dispute that nobody needs at the moment. The agreement on the management of the migration crisis at the highest level is necessary for the preservation of peace and stability. If we continue behaving as we are behaving now, all positive effects of the European integration will be undone and will set our continent back 20 years. Thank you.
Onorevole Atkinson.
Ms. Atkinson, 1 minute.
Ahead of the Council meeting, I'm going to read a letter that I have written to Mr Tusk on behalf of the UK. Dear Mr Tusk, as your special relationship with Mr Cameron clearly isn't working, and his so-called negotiations with you have collapsed like a pack of cards, I thought it might be helpful to outline what the British people actually want from the EU. Trade. As we are the second largest economy in the Union, we must be able to negotiate our own free trade agreements, because one commissioner for 28 states does not fit all. Agriculture. A common agricultural policy costs us more to feed our own people and keeps developing countries like Africa in poverty. Fisheries. We want to take back control of our own territorial waters, restore our fishing fleets and protect our own fishing stocks. Justice. We do not want and accept a separate court in Luxembourg overruling the UK judiciary and directly elected members of Parliament. And migration control. Well, you know what the British people want here. We must have control over who comes to Britain, and that's non-negotiable. And you cannot deliver on this, so therefore we will Brexit.
Onorevole González Pons.
Ms. González Pons, 1 minute 30. Thank you, President. Last weekend, terrorists struck again 2 police officers in Kabul. Nobody's mentioned that yet. Here we talk about terrorist attacks. It's becoming an day-to-day event. If we accept that, then they will have won and we will have sacrificed freedom. Europe has always been built on the basis of having more Europe. That's why we support the Commission proposal to have a European border and coast guard. In the absence of internal borders, there are not truly external borders. There are European borders. They are our borders, the borders of us all. We cannot distinguish between two types of borders because we don't have internal borders. We just have borders. The Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, Greek border is also the German, Belgian and French border. Belgians, French and Germans are just as much interested in defending those borders as the Italian, Spanish, Portuguese and Greeks, because they're their borders too. Our security, our common security, is at stake. And for that reason, countries in the middle of Europe, geographically in the middle, have an interest in defending the borders. And if a country does not do its job properly defending its border, then the rest of us have a legitimate right to participate in defending that border, because it's not that country's border, it's our border. We don't have individual countries having borders anymore. We have European borders. Europe is like a child growing up. It may have a fever at the moment, but it's still going to grow up.
Naturalmente, onorevole González Pons.
Mr. González Pons, of course, the two Spanish agents who were killed in front of the Spanish embassy in Kabul meet with condolences from all of us. Ms. Van Bremt.
Thank you. This is the last council during the Luxembourg presidency, and we look back at a terrible year. We don't have to go into the details of that, but there was one very positive point, and that was the climate agreement. There was a very intelligent presidency and an intelligent commission, and their cooperation was excellent, which we must certainly emphasize. But we must have more ambitious goals, and it's something we can discuss in the future. Something else I'd like to discuss with the Commission. There's a new report from Amnesty International about Turkey, and it's shocking. We see violent breaches of human rights, and that is perhaps something that is happening because of the lack of support from the EU. We can't keep talking about human rights in grand speeches. We must look at what's happening in Turkey, and I think that the Commission should take the necessary action.
Mr. Czarnecki, one.
Mr. President, President Juncker, we are at a turning point, a very serious turning point indeed. I think what we have to look for a healthy compromise between what the majority of member states want and what the minority is ready to accept. This has been mentioned today in this chamber. We should take decisions that have to be accepted by government and society. Well, let me repeat, society in the member states, especially those member states that never had colonies in their past and that today are supposed to pay for this, pay dividend for this. We have to talk about this also in the context of energy policy. I think that we have double standards being applied here. Yes, the EU solidarity, we only talk about it when we talk about migration, but when it comes to Nord Stream, there is no solidarity.
La parola onorevole Gabriele per 1 minuto.
Ms. Gabrielle, 1 minute 30.
Président, oui, cette réunion du Conseil.
President, yes, this Council summit is time to take stock of a year where much has been done and to look realistically to the work yet to be done. Our area of freedom, security and justice is being tested on two fronts, migration and terrorism. We must strengthen it and defend it against those who use fear to argue for simplistic political solutions. On migration, Europe has reached real milestones this year. I'm thinking about the Frontex budget, the Sofia operation, the Valletta summit and the Western Balkans summit, and the proposal for a new European agency to provide a Coast Guard and border force. and then implementation according to a timetable of all these elements, which requires unstinting efforts. On fighting terrorism, achievements are a mixed bag. Our citizens are expecting hard and fast measures. It's anachronistic to think of security in national terms. What member state can provide its security alone now? None. European cooperation needs each member state to cooperate. There are 4 immediate factors. Firstly, we need to cross-reference European and national databases. Secondly, we need member states to make available their files, Europol files, on foreign fighters. Then we need to work more offensively on combating pro-terrorist speech, and then we need to conclude on the PNR directive. And then we also need to offer no blank checks in foreign affairs. We need to support Lebanon and Jordan better, extreme virgins at the borders, including Sahel. Mrs. Gabrielle, there's a blue card. Would you like to respond? Mrs. Gomez.
No doubt that you are a committed European, and I very much agree with what you said, that there should be no exploitation of fear to actually deal with the fight against terrorism, and at the same time our responsibility to welcome refugees and migrants. But that's not what Mr. Tusk has been doing when he made these nasty statements about the need to have migrants and refugees in detention for over 18 months. I didn't hear anyone from a political family repudiate that. Or is it just a nasty competition between him and another nasty Donald?
Madame Gabriel, vous avez la parole.
Ms. Gabriel, you have the floor.
I think we need to differentiate between the intergovernmental ideology and council statements, and that's where the member states' responsibilities lie, compared to the message we're sending out in the European Parliament, which is a pro-European, community-minded message, the idea of a common response, defending our values. I think in the face of such criticism, we need clearly to state what the limits are of the intergovernmental approach if we're to continue to progress constructively and more tangibly.
Ms. Wilmot, 1 minute.
Thank you, President. It will not surprise anyone that I've long been a critic of David Cameron's reckless approach to the EU. And I still find it hard to believe that Britain, as a proud nation, respected for its skills in diplomacy and influence throughout the world, finds itself in a situation where its position as a global leader could be under threat. But there are signs that the Prime Minister may be starting to understand that his strategy of taking our country to the brink of exit may not be a wise one. I desperately hope that sanity prevails and a sensible deal will be reached. But regardless of what happens in the negotiations, Britain is better off in the EU, and the EU is better off with Britain as a member. So I am proud that the Labour Party will be campaigning hard to make sure Britain remains in the EU. Labour will fight to safeguard jobs, Labour will fight for security, Labour will fight to protect working rights. For British people, British families and British workers, Labour will fight to keep Britain's rightful place at the heart of the EU.
I wanted to inform you that from now on there will be no more blue cards, because that would endanger our catch the eye, because at 12 o'clock we have the Sakharov Prize. Mr. Niedermayer, 1 minute 30.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. First of all, let me thank the Commission and Mr. Juncker for his deep commitment to preserve the Schengen system. This is very important, not only for the future of some of us, but for the future of Europe. Thank you. The second, I share also his view that in the current difficult situation we must act together. Each of us should take part of the responsibility in dealing with this crisis. Only together we can make it. If we make it, this will make us stronger. Each crisis that we overcome, each problem we solve, will make Europe stronger. And we badly need it in the future to be able to deal with the challenges. I very much welcome the proposal of the Commission to improve the protection of our borders. This is exactly what people are legitimately asking for, to make sure that Europe protects its borders. There is no excuse to say to people that decision-making is complicated, there are constraints in domestic policy, we just must act. And I am very grateful that the Commission finally did it. At the same time, I was surprised to learn how weak is our information system on Schengen borders. We must improve it. We must have the available information. We must know who is in, who is out, and we must solve it smart way as soon as possible. Last year, we mentioned, as our chairman, Mr. Weber, mentioned, we have a plan. We have a plan that is feasible and good. We must just fulfill it. There is no excuse. We will support the Commission, and I hope we will succeed and get the situation in migration crisis under control. Thank you.
Madame Beres,
Ms. Beres, 1 minute. Thank you, President. I agree with President Juncker when he says that it's not a time for half measures. But I think when Mr. Weber says that we don't need new ideas, I think we should listen to that too. I don't know what Mr. Weber is referring to with that, but if we don't have half measures, then we need to have Member States' support for implementation of the new Commission proposal to take Frontex forward so that we complete Schengen and ensure that we can protect our borders. But it is equally urgent, and we need the same determination to ensure that we have fiscal capacity and budgetary capacity within the euro area, because otherwise there will not be a capital markets union and we will not see convergence. So we need more than two half measures to make one measure, and we need to ensure that member states can take the European spirit forward at a time when we're going to be entering very difficult negotiations relating to Brexit, or should I say anti-Brexit. There's Galpelch, 1 minute 30.
Thank you, President. Dear Commissioner, dear colleagues, every crisis is also a chance, an opportunity. This is true for the migration crisis, which is an opportunity for us to identify the values of the EU and to prioritize the values which are the basis of the EU, what we believe in, which would serve us in solving the problem by reason, so that not the events should manage our steps, but we should tackle the events themselves. We cannot turn a blind eye to the facts that wouldn't serve us well. I'm also convinced that if in the course of solving the problem, if we hear an opinion which we don't like, and we cannot blame each other for that, this would toss the whole process towards chaos. We have to prevail, we have to keep Schengen in place, we say, whereas more and more countries introduce the border controls. Why is it a problem if those who are in favor of Schengen fulfill on the EU law, whereas if they do so, infringement procedure is put in place against them? I don't know what's behind this, I don't know the reason, but if talk and measures go against each other, that's detrimental. We need clear rules that can be observed, a joint solution which is shared by everyone, which is implementable by everyone, and everyone shares the will to do so.
Ms. Toya, 1 minute.
Well, we need to know the identities of those who enter our space, but we have this common responsibility in the immigration policy, the reception and so on. Otherwise we won't work as a union. We have undertaken certain commitments, and it's all one process. If we look at it all in context, I look at Italy, we have been heroic. I would like to underscore that. We have been heroic in contributing what we needed to do, but there is something that doesn't meet. 127 people have been resettled. People out of the 40,000 that have been foreseen. This is a shame. People can't really accuse Italy, but there are people who may have votes, but they shouldn't just vote for the Orban. They should perhaps vote as a disqualification. Let's forget Dublin. It's dead. We should look at our own European policy of common solidarity. Let's do take some clear actions. We as Europeans should be allies of those forces in this chamber who are in favor of Europe. We should not be with those who are against.
Mr. Rangel, for a minute.
First of all, President, let me make it clear that the Commission's position, in particular the President's position expressed today on Schengen, is absolutely crucial, and I hope that Council be able to follow President Juncker. President Juncker's statement that he will never accept limiting or placing conditions upon Schengen is as important as when President Draghi said he wouldn't let the euro disappear and would do all he could to keep it, because the Schengen and the euro are two of the most fundamental aspects of the European Union, and we need to see now Council being as strong as the Commission has proved to be. Another point that's not really been much raised today, and has to do with the underpinnings of economic and monetary union. Commission is still trying to set up the pillars which will support banking union. It's crucial that Council stops hedging, stops coming up with the uncertain positions it has done now, and that it comes out clearly and makes it clear that in the first half of 2016 the deposit guarantee system will be set up to help the banking union. Otherwise the euro won't be a real currency. We need a proper banking system to underpin it. Thank you very much. Ms. Garcia Perez.
Thank you. I want to join in the condolences for the soldiers, the families of the soldiers who died in Kabul. Some people are trying to paint the picture as if it's one of recuperation, while at the same time Mr. Juncker a couple of days ago recognized that we haven't yet got over the economic crisis that we're facing. The millions of families in Europe which are spending time suffering from the austerity policies being applied are very aware of the situation, and the Plan Juncker and the Stability Plan are important instruments, but if we don't understand the real necessity of a fiscal impulse, we're actually doing them a poor favour. We have to be ambitious. If we don't move forward in the proper measures in the social area, such as the setting up of a minimum wage at the European level, we're actually failing our citizens. Now, the recuperation at the moment is slow and it's not going far enough. We have to bear in mind something, that the change, either it's going to work completely or it won't work at all. And the moment is now. We've got to do something now. We've got to put forward an economic and social agenda to try and get back the values of Europe that we need to have today.
Mr. Suica, 1 minute.
We said that no country can on its own guarantee its own security, and yesterday we were saying that a reply was needed at a European level to a European problem. It is true that with our politics we shape our own future and what will happen in Europe as of 2016. Mr. Juncker said that there is no European government here, but in a time of crisis we have to act as if we had a European government, and we must all help to make sure that our European politics is successful. Nobody wants the end of Schengen. Schengen is being called into question, and this is why now we have to take measures. There are different criteria being applied in Europe by the countries of the north and the south, the rich or the less rich, those within and those without Schengen. And I'm from Croatia, which isn't a Schengen country. I wonder, Mr. Timmermans, what you're going to do to ensure that Croatia, Bulgaria and Romania are able to enter the Schengen area as swiftly as possible, so that we will finally know where the border, the external border of the European Union is, which will be the borders to be defended. There won't then be barbed wire between Croatia and Slovenia. And I'm sure that when that time comes, all of these questions will have to be sorted out and help us to get into Schengen as quickly as possible.
Mr. Niedermüller, 1 minute, please.
Thank you, Chair. We can see today that the migration crisis, the refugees, are a very important point in the history of the European Union. Not because of the numbers, but because of the fact that the member states are having to look at policies. We have to have governments which are now, in fact, putting forward a populist approach, an incitement to hatred. They want to bring disagreement into the European Union. And they're not actually putting forward a situation that Europe's already lived in the past. We aren't actually responding to the economic and the political challenges that we really face. What they're actually doing is they're putting forward their own old song. So here what they're doing is they're destroying our unity. We believe in Europe, and if we believe in Europe, we've got to come up and state our moral principles. We have to fight against the populist and the extreme policies of the right. Otherwise, we are only going to be going back to nationalists in Europe. And we're not going to have a Europe that's going to look at saving the refugees, but actually dealing with populist policy.
Mr. Kelly, 1 minute, please.
President, the talk about Brexit reminds me of a poem in my own language. What difference does that make to someone who isn't involved in it? In one way, it doesn't involve us, but in another way, of course, it does. The British will make the decision at the end of the day, but as far as Ireland is concerned, there's a very close relationship between us and Britain, and has been for a long time. We joined the European Union at the same time. I hope that Britain will remain in the European Union, and I hope that will be forever. If Britain were to leave the European Union, it would greatly negatively affect the Irish economy, and particularly the border in Ireland. If Britain were to leave the European Union, and one of the most populous countries in Europe, and English has become the de facto language of Europe. So I ask the Commission to listen to David Cameron and make every effort to come to an agreement with him.
Mr. Tang, 1 minute, please.
Thank you, Chair. We've so many things to deal with. We've got the British referendum. The Tusk wants to have a talk with no taboos about what the British want. Well, that's okay, but we have to important that we understand what the starting point of the debate is. They're looking at how we're going to actually limit the number of migrants. Well, that, I think, is something that is more about the shame. It's about unfair competition. It's, in fact, therefore, that's why we see the Commission coming forward with some of its proposals at the moment. Having said that, the discussions over the desires and the proper wishes that the British have is, in fact, very welcome. We need to see that in Europe. We can see that Europe, that if we give some speed for or some space for national identity, that in fact helps them to be strong anchored in the European Union. We have to ensure that we can come to a proper debate, so at the end of the day, the British will be able to stay inside the European Union with conviction.
Mr. Kellam, 1 minute, please.
President, 3 points. First, I would like to thank the Commission for its bold border guard initiative, and I very much insist that the Member States could overcome their differences and approve it better this weekend. Second, Syrian crisis should not lead attention aside from the Ukraine and continuing Russian aggression. Let's remember that Mr. Putin has broken the system of international security, continues to break it, and views the West not as his partner but adversary. Therefore, any hesitations about continuation of sanctions would undermine the very political and moral credibility of the EU. Mr. Putin, unfortunately, is not part of the solution. He remains part of the problem. Third, I wish that Nord Stream 2 should be assessed by Council on the basis of Commissioner Cañete's arguments from October. Clearly, it's no private deal, but a political project to weaken Ukraine and deepen dependence on Russian gas by all of us. And let me finally wish both the Commission and the Council an invigorating Christmas spirit of hope, persistence and, not the least, satisfaction. Thank you very much.
Onorevole Jotova per un minuto.
Mrs. Jotova, 1 minute, please.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President. I think we need to say today, have we managed to come up with a holistic European policy to try to manage the migratory crisis? Council needed 8 meetings to adopt so-called urgent measures proposed by the Commission and approved by this House. The crisis today wouldn't be as serious as it is if the measures had been applied in good time. In fact, 2015 has just been a preparation year for the holistic policy in migration that we want. But we need now to stop talking and do something. It's been a while since we've been waiting for the Commission proposal for more border control. The Commission this morning told us that that is an absolute priority, the protection of Schengen. But why leave Bulgaria, Romania and Croatia outside the framework of the new agency when they also have external EU borders? We have a sort of buffer zone now in these countries, which will bring in migrants but won't be able to move into the Schengen states from those countries and won't be able to go back either. We're seeing a double standards which might make things worse in the Balkans with a spillover effect for the rest of Europe. Thank you. Mr. McAllister, 1 minute, please.
Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, the summit will on Thursday evening be dealing with the British referendum, as we've heard many times today. And it's not a simple job, because on the one hand you've got the British government which is support to stay in the European Union in its referendum, and on the other hand you've got all the achievements of a successful European integration which mustn't be called into question. I think the December Council is simply a staging post, because at the end of this the legal and political details will have to be looked into to make sure that you get an agreement, and that will be decisive. And in that, all of those that are involved must play a constructive role. The European People's Party will certainly be doing that. From my point of view, I think it would be good if in February we were able to strike a sensible compromise so that we could then try and bring some light into the thing. Say yes to Remain, say no to Brexit is what we would say in English.
Honorable Kaufmann.
Mrs. Kaufmann, 1 minute, please.
Thank you, Chair. The protection of the EU external borders is a common European task. Now, the last weeks and months have shown that unless we have a common approach, we're just going to have chaos and national egoism. Therefore, it's absolutely essential that we actually improve border protection across the EU. But protecting the borders better doesn't mean that we can actually reduce our human rights. People have got to have the right for asylum. People who are fleeing from war have got to ensure that they're going to be protected according to international standards. And the revision of the system, such as a permanent and a mandatory distribution of the refugees, would actually show proper solidarity. What we need for this is deeds and not just words. The challenge for Europe is becoming greater when we see that the governments are simply not implementing the decisions and they're not working together. The European community must not turn into a community of mistrust, and therefore I'm calling on the governments to take their responsibilities on board and stand aware that Europe stands for humanity, tolerance and solidarity.
Passiamo al catch the eye, posso concedere soltanto.
Catch the eye now. We've only got 5 speakers. Ms. Jojdová first.
Děkuji, vážený pane předsedo, za udělení slova.
Thanks very much, Mr. President. I wanted to thank President Juncker and his Vice President for having told us the Commission's plans for the protection of our external borders. President Juncker told us that security and freedom have to go hand in hand. They can't exist one without the other. I totally endorse that comment. Nor do I think that we can have solidarity without bearing security in mind too. So I'm very pleased that the Commission has been active in submitting its proposal for active external border protection. If member states can't afford to protect their borders themselves, they have to go along with a European solution. Thank you. Ms. Benova.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Of course, in 1 minute it is very difficult to mention all the issues concerning the incoming summit, but I would like to mention one thing that is related also to the summit. That is a lot of marketing, a lot of presentations, a lot of words, but then finally no results. And I'm worried that this summit will end up with proposals that will not be then finally approved by the member states, and the heads of government will then show up in front of cameras and say that Europe has failed. So what do we have to do is to prepare some discussion, a good discussion, and when finally we will know that some proposal will have a chance to be successful, then to show this to the public. Because people ask us, what are we doing here in the institutions? What does the EU do? Because they don't see any results. So please pass Merry Christmas wishes to the heads of government, but please come with some proposal that would be then really realistic and people will be happy. Thank you.
It's okay, it's okay, it's okay, it's okay, it's okay. Yes, it's okay.
Mr. Marias, thank you, Mr. President. Despite the efforts that are being made in Greece and efforts made by the Commission, we have to realise now that Frontex, in charge of protecting borders, has to do a job in Greece as well. There are now grounds for crisis-style intervention because of people coming over the border between Turkey and Greece. There are now grounds, as I say, to act on the territory of member states. And as Mr. Weber said, there are already issues as far as German and French borders are concerned as well, not to forget countries such as the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia. New Frontex needs to deal with these issues as well. Greece has sovereign rights as far as protecting its own borders are concerned, but it wants to remain in Schengen, so I think it should consider withdrawing from Schengen right now. Thanks very much.
Silikiotis.
Mr. Silikiotis, 1 minute, please. President, while we are speaking this morning, there have been tragedies occurring in the Mediterranean. Lives have been lost. The refugee crisis continues, and people are losing their lives. The European Parliament needs to act. We need to set up rescue teams which will assist refugees in situations such as the ones that I've been describing. Proposals to allow Frontex to carry out border control activities in member states will, I think, reduce the sovereignty of member states and won't allow member states to show solidarity and protect refugees themselves. The European Union has problems with Turkey. We're trying to treat with Turkey while that country still continues to violate human rights and kill journalists and human rights defenders. It's vitally important that member states, particularly those in the Mediterranean who are suffering from the wave of refugees, are allowed to have support so that they can continue to provide humanitarian assistance. Ms. Morvai, 1 minute please, as the President.
Köszönöm szépen, még ezen az úgynevezett kiemelt vitán, amelyik az
Thank you very much. In this important debate, where we are looking at some of the most difficult questions, but once again there's too few of us here in the room. Mr. Juncker might have felt very lonely up there. He's gone, and we've just got the representative. I've got to ask representative what he thinks. Have you taken the proper consequences in the European institutions after the attack in Paris? From a practical point of view, how have these people got to Europe? Are we collecting the data that is being that we need to collect and that isn't being collected? What's been done from a police point of view? Are we acting in an efficient manner, in an effective manner? Have we actually done things that should have been done from a simple practical point of view? What is the European Union doing in order to avoid these kind of attacks in the future? The task is not something that's very simple, but we've got to make sure that we're more efficient in dealing with these issues.
Thank you. That was the final Catch the Eye speech. In French, let me stress that at noon the award of the Sakharov Prize will take place. So let me ask Commission and Council to comply with our timing. Thanks in advance. Vice President Timmermans, you have the floor, sir.
Grazie, Presidente. I will be brief, as per your request. You know, in the course of our history, we Europeans have been incredible at creating results. We are creative, we are adaptable, and in the course of our history we've also been very good at destruction, at killing each other. Nobody does it better than we do. And we've learned after 2 failed attempts, fortunately, of collective suicide, that working together is a lot better than trying to do it on our own and looking for confrontation. This year has seen a perfect storm. On top of an economic crisis, a banking crisis which has already eaten away at people's self-confidence, came the huge challenge of the terrorism crisis, and on top of that the refugee crisis. No wonder that many Europeans are unhappy with the present situation. But it is my profound belief that looking for solutions individually at the expense of other Europeans, against other Europeans, is moving back to a part of our history I thought we had left behind us forever. We will only come out of these crises if we work together. That is the spirit with which the Commission has made the proposals. Are the proposals perfect? I don't pretend they are. But they are a positive step towards solving a problem at our borders. They are a positive step towards showing to European citizens that we need to solve this together. If the states have better solutions, better options, please put them on the table. We are not dogmatic about them. But let me say one thing to conclude. We need to do a better job at protecting our external borders. There is no contradiction between being Europeans and being protective of our external borders. We are a community of values based on solidarity, and solidarity is something that means that you stick together. And it doesn't mean that what I hear Ms. Keller say, that we should have a European Union without borders. That is elitist populism. We cannot survive without borders. We have to select at our borders who has the right to international protection and who does not have the right to international protection and should be returned to their countries. The only way we can maintain solidarity in our society for people who deserve international protection is to assure that the people who get it deserve it. Otherwise we will undermine even the support for those who need international protection. Let's be in no illusion about that. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
Thank you very much, Vice President Timmermans, for your help. And now, Minister Schmit, in name of the Council. You have the floor.
Monsieur le Président.
Chair, MEPs, I want to thank you for the debate and the messages that have been given to the European Council. As the draft conclusion has been mentioned, I would like to say that if we implement everything that is in this draft paper, if we adopt it and we implement it, we will have moved forward very far, real progress. And inside this progress, for me, there's something that's absolutely essential. It's to preserve free movement of European citizens and their safety. European citizens want both, and it's up to us to guarantee both this freedom and this safety. Yes, we do have to speed up the implementation of everything that has been decided. That has to happen quickly and it has to happen efficiently. It's true that this isn't the moment for half solutions or half measures. But when we look back a couple of months, was Europe immobile? Has nothing been done? Has nothing been adopted? No, we've got a very long list. And thanks to the European Parliament, a lot of things that we've achieved. Progress, like PNR, like data protection, like the platform against illegal work, and so forth and so on. So Europe is moving, but it's true that we were in fact caught short by the drama which is currently playing out on our borders as a result of the crisis in Syria and the migratory crisis. And it's perhaps because we have forgotten that European construction is a response to the tragic dimension of history, and the Vice President of the Commission said it in a certain way also. 2 world wars, fascism, an economic crisis, Auschwitz. And because of that, we must not forget that history remains tragedy, as in fact Renoir said when he was talking about the invasion of Afghanistan by the Soviet Union. So we have to try and find the energy to act, and that's about deciding together what we can achieve together, because it is in fact the case that the challenges that we face are enormous. All those people who are calling for us falling back into our national interests or our nationalist interests, I think, are dreamers. They're dreamers who don't understand the size of, of what's at stake, or in fact the challenges of history. And we will fight to the very end, including in the next Council, as we've done over the past few months, in order to fight for a strong Europe, a Europe that's capable of acting and that respects its values. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup pour votre soutien.
Thanks very much. Thanks for your support. In Italian. The debate is closed, and we now move on to the award of the Sakharov Prize.
société démocratique, le poder démocratique.
Andrei Saharov, our pueblo, the situation is all the more tragic. На свободную, нецензурированную.
Эта премия так само молодых лидеров. Give me the opportunity to speak from Quando va a venire la c'est dramatique, il faut que ça s'arrête. Société démocratique, le poder démocratique.
Andrei Saharov, our pueblo, the situation is all the more tragic. На свободную, нецензурированную.
Эта премия так само молодых лидеров. Give me the opportunity to speak from Quando va a venire la c'est dramatique, il faut que ça s'arrête. Société démocratique, le poder démocratique.
Andrei Saharov, our pueblo, the situation is all the more tragic. На свободную, нецензурированную.
Эта премия так само молодых лидеров. Give me the opportunity to speak from Quando va a venire la c'est dramatique, il faut que ça s'arrête. Société démocratique, le poder démocratique.
Andrei Saharov, our pueblo, the situation is all the more tragic. На свободную, нецензурированную.
Эта премия так само молодых лидеров. Give me the opportunity to speak from Quando va a venire la
Ja, nehmen Sie Platz. Hanno, schiebt das Ding mal ein bisschen näher hier. Liebe
colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, can I ask you to take your seats, please? We would like to begin by showing you a brief video.
liebe Kolleginnen und
Colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, it is a great honor for me in honoring this year's Sakharov Prize winner Raif Badawi to bring to your attention the fact that he is unable to be here because he has made a call for freedom of thought, and he has been condemned to 10 years in prison and 1,000 lashes. And because the dramatic news reached us that he, in addition to that, is now in isolation, in detention, and therefore is unable to be here to receive the Sakharov Prize in person. It is, however, a great honor and a pleasure for me to be able to welcome his very brave, dignified wife, Ensa Haida, here to the European Parliament on his behalf. There are many guests who have done us the honor of attending the 2015 Sakharov Prize award ceremony, and there are representatives of the diplomatic corps, including two guests who I would like to welcome very warmly, and I agreed with Mrs. Haida that I would address these to Olga Shorina and Boris Nemtsov Foundation and Mrs. Aristi Goista, the representative of the Venezuelan opposition movement. These are both groups which were also in the competition for this award, and I would like to express my thoughts to you. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for being here. And Mrs. Haidar, I would like to salute the courageous fight that your husband has conducted. And Mrs. Haidar, I would like personally to say to your family and to your children and to your friends that you have behaved in a dignified and resolved and courageous way in order to try and bring your husband home. And you have 3 children who are 12, 11 and 8 years of age and who are waiting for the return of their father. And I would like to express the feelings of this House. And you have had to flee to Canada with your 3 children because of death threats, where you have been continuing your tireless fight for the freeing of your husband, and where you are giving him a voice whilst he is prevented from being able to use his own voice to speak out. And therefore, on behalf of all of us, I would once again call on King Salman to grant mercy to Raif Badawi, and without further ado to release him and allow him to return to his family. Despite the great risks, Raif Badawi, as a blogger, bravely supported freedom of thought, promoting it, and all he was doing was exercising his right to freedom of expression, and he was filling thereby a gap in a country where there is the lack of a free press. There's a vacuum in the country for the freedom of expression of thought, and Raif Badawi spoke up for the right, the human right, of being able to speak your thoughts in a country, in a society in which the thoughts and ideas of others need to be spoken out. And he had a book of his collected thoughts which he dictated, and he said that he wished to bring light into society and to break down the walls of ignorance, and was pursuing the goal of the inalienability of spiritual questioning in his country, and respect for the freedom of thought and the freedom of belief, and also respect of the rights of women, the protection of minorities, and the fundamental rights of citizens, whereby each individual person can have those rights guaranteed. And it is in that way that in 2006 Raif Badawi set up the Saudi Free Liberals Forum internet site, calling for religious, cultural and political reforms publicly in a discussion forum. 2 years later, the government forced him to close down that forum, but he didn't give up. Quite to the contrary, he came back with a new internet forum, the Saudi Free Liberals Network, and that had 10,000 members discussing politics. And when the so-called Arab Spring reached the arena, there was a lively debate on that platform and on that network, and the closing down of Badawi's network was an enormous loss for freedom of expression in his country. He was not only censored, we know that he was arrested and received the first 50 lashes before a crowd, and his flogging aroused great distaste throughout the world, and there was broad condemnation of these events. And following the deterioration of his already poor health, the further lashes were postponed. Raif Badawi has become a symbolic figure and has served as inspiration for all of those who wish to support basic rights, not just in that region, but far beyond that throughout the world. And it is true that Raif Badawi is not alone in that fight. His own lawyer, Balit Abu Akayya, 36 years old, was sentenced to 15 years in prison, and as an observer of of human rights, and condemning human rights abuses, Dr. Abdul Kudur, who was responsible for civil and citizens' rights, was arrested and was sentenced to 8 years in prison and a 10-year travel ban. And only a few weeks ago, Ashraf Fayat, a young poet, and was condemned because of apostasy and condemned to death. And nevertheless, the trial was condemned because of inadequate processes. Then Ali Mohammed al-Nimr, 21 years old. He wasn't even 18 years old when he was arrested. And he was calling for equal rights in Saudi Arabia, and nevertheless condemned to death with crucifixion. We are deeply concerned and shocked about reports that this sentence will be executed in the coming days. And because of what we have done for Raif Badawi, we have a resolution of the European Parliament that calls on the Saudi authorities, and I am doing this on behalf of all of us, and I'm repeating it once again today. Allow Mr. Mohammed al-Nimr to be released, suspend the death sentence, and desist from the execution of this gruesome sentence. But, colleagues, these are just a few of many cases that have affected political prisoners, and we are calling on the Saudi authorities to ensure that the systematic oppression of those that seek to express their thoughts should be stopped, and that they must live up to what they have ratified by way of international agreements. For example, the international ban on torture ratified by Saudi Arabia, the agreement on the rights of children, the agreement on any form of discrimination against women. The international community and the Saudi authority have a right to have higher demands placed on them because the country is a member of the UN Human Rights Council. And it has been underscored that the regrettable human rights situation does not match these responsibilities that a country has signed up to in the context of the United Nations Human Rights Council. And having this year become a member of that council, nevertheless 150 people have been executed, and Saudi Arabian society allows there is a very great number of people using the social media, and yet there is great censorship of the media. There are more than 400,000 websites that have been blocked, and worse still, those that use the internet to avail themselves of the possibility of social media and to express their thoughts are being punished most harshly. Nevertheless, we are prepared to dialogue, a dialogue on human rights between the EU and Saudi Arabia at a parliamentary level, might contribute to being able to improve the situation, to promote mutual understanding and bring about reforms. There have no doubt been some positive developments. There has been a law on private associations and organizations which are now permitted, and there is unimpeded access for civil society. There's been some progress on the rights of women in elections, but nevertheless the country is far away from equality, and we do support equality between men and women, and we oppose any form of discrimination, and we call on Saudi Arabia to live up to its commitments and ensure that the system where men take precedence over women should be abolished. This is not a valid way of proceeding in the 21st century. Mrs. Haidar, ladies and gentlemen, guests, no form of terror, no form of punishment will stand in the way of us fighting for human rights, and no security argument, no arms deal, no trade in oil should stop us in doing so. Rauf Badawi said it in these words: the freedom of expression is the air that a thinker breathes, at the same time as it is the fuel that enables the fire of his ideas to burn up. So, ladies and gentlemen, it is a great honor to award the Sakharov Prize for Freedom of Thought by the European Parliament in 2015 to Rauf Badawi, and I hope that in the near future we will be able to receive him here in this plenary chamber in the very close future.
ألف شكر لكم جميعا. شكرا سيدي رئيس البرلمان.
Thank you very much indeed, ladies and gentlemen. Mr. President, honourable members of the European Parliament, thank you for being here this afternoon. It's an honour for me to be in your hemicycle. It of course would have been nice if my husband could have received the prize personally. But if I may, I'd like to ask you to respect 1 minute's silence as a tribute to those who lost their lives in France and elsewhere. What my husband would like would be a minute's silence paying tribute to these victims. Thank you.
ألف شكر لكم.
Thank you very much indeed.
سيد رئيس البرلمان الأوروبي، أيها السيدات.
Mr. President of the European Parliament, honourable members of the Parliament, I stand here before you speaking boldly to the representatives of the great nations of Europe to say how proud I am of my husband and to be here in one of the great arenas for democracy. Let me actually quote an article my husband wrote. Freedom of expression is like the air we breathe, that all those who think breathe. It's the thought, it's the fuel that makes us think. And nations have moved forward thanks to their thinkers' ideas. And this is what has led them towards prosperity, progress and civilization. The international community and world jurist associations have called upon the Arab world to allow freedom of expression. They believe that freedom of expression is a fundamental right. If you are a human being, you have the right to think as you wish, to believe, think, love, hate, be a liberal or an Islamist. You have the right to be any of those things and to do any of those things. An intellectual in an Arab country has always had to carry out contortions, has always had to beat about the bush to get his message across, because a clear, simple message is regarded as being tantamount to blasphemy. That's the ideology in certain Arab countries. Arab societies frequently believe that free thought is decadence and is an insult to religion, even though it quite clearly is not. Thinkers in the Arab world work, therefore, are obliged to work in a very unnatural way. A thinker ought to be able to express himself or herself freely, even if their thoughts are mistaken, even if they have to go against the grain when it comes to religious thought. Society needs to be open, needs to tolerate all sorts of currents of ideas and thought. Society needs to listen to the opinions of all its citizens, even those who are criticizing it in a constructive way. That's the basis for a constructive dialogue which will allow thought and society both to flourish. If you look at the situation in the Arab world, you'll see that society is now under the yoke of a theocratic regime. It calls upon citizens simply to nod and accept everything that religious leaders tell them. This has been imposed, this submission, and today